deep within the folds of time, where the shadows of the east stretch longer than the daylight. There are stories that were never meant to be told to the living. Tonight, we aren't just crossing borders, we are crossing the veil. You've heard of ghosts that haunt houses, but have you heard of the spirits that haunt the very fabric of power, greed, and the human soul? From the judgment halls of the underworld to the silent, suffocating corridors of forgotten palaces, these 7 tales are not mere folklore. They are warnings. The ancients believed that if you whisper a name in the dark might just whisper back. So, lock your doors, dim the lights, and whatever you do, do not look at the reflections in your window. Let us begin our descent into the 5 chambers of Eastern dread. The gluttonous magistrate. The rain in the borderlands didn't fall the way it did in towns with names people remembered. Out here it fell like it had nowhere else to go, thin needles slanting across the road, turning the dust into a skin of mud that clung to your shoes and refused to let go. The sky was a bruised sheet, low enough that it felt like you could reach up and smear your fingers through it. There were no lanterns along the path, no helpful milestone stones, only the faint shimmer of wet grass and the occasional glint of water gathering in ruts carved by cartwheels from months ago, maybe years. I had been walking since late afternoon, and by the time dusk arrived, it didn't arrive in a clean line. It seeped in slow, patient, until everything looked like it was being viewed through stained paper. I could no longer tell the difference between a distant tree and a kneeling man. I could no longer trust shadows, and I was hungry, not the dramatic kind of hunger that makes you feel faint. The quiet, humiliating kind. The kind that makes you count your breaths, because each inhale feels like it costs something. I'd left my village with a pouch of rice and a small strip of dried fish, and that food had lasted exactly as long as hope usually does. Now there was only the taste of rainwater and iron in my mouth. Somewhere behind me, the last village I'd passed had already closed its doors. Somewhere ahead, the border town the locals called Heshway waited like a rumor. I wasn't going there because I had a choice. I was going because it was the only place left that might still have a library, a magistrate's office that required scribes, a teacher who would exchange coin for a man willing to copy texts in careful strokes. I was a poor scholar with good handwriting, and my future had narrowed into a single road. The wind moved through the scrub and reeds like breath through teeth. It made a sound soft, almost human, like something whispering with its mouth closed. I remember stopping, because the sound felt too close, like it was happening right beside my ear. But it was only the grass, only the rain, only the night beginning to take its seat. I kept walking, a little after full dark. I saw it. At first, it was just a darker shape among darker shapes. A rise of stone half swallowed by weeds, broken pillars leaning like old men, then a pale glimmer, moonlight or lightning. I couldn't say, caught on an object set into the slope. It might have been a fallen statue. It might have been a marker. I stepped closer, mud sucking at my soles, and the shape became clear. A temple, not a grand one. Nothing like the shrine in my hometown where the roof tiles were painted and the incense never went out. This one had been abandoned long enough for nature to begin rewriting it. The courtyard wall had collapsed in 2 places. The carved wooden doors were gone. What remained of the roof had caved in at the corners, and rainwater spilled from the eaves in steady, patient streams, like tears that had learned to fall forever. Still, it was shelter. I didn't hesitate. A poor scholar learns quickly that dignity is an expensive habit. I pushed through a curtain of wet vines, stepped into the courtyard, and felt the temperature change. Not warmer, just different, as though the air inside the temple grounds had been held in the mouth of something larger. The courtyard stones were slick and uneven. Moss had claimed the cracks. In the center, an incense burner sat like a blackened bowl, filled not with ash, but with rainwater. The statue at the far end, whatever god had once been honored here, had lost its face. The head was still there, but the features had worn away until it was an oval, smooth and blank, staring forever at nothing. I stood for a long moment and listened. No footsteps, no voices, only rain, only wind, and beneath it, something else, a faint, steady sound, like wet cloth being chewed. I swallowed. My first thought was rats. Any ruin had rats, but this sounded too heavy, too deliberate, like a mouth working through something soft with satisfaction. Then it stopped, abruptly, as if whoever or whatever was eating had sensed my presence. The silence that followed was worse. I told myself I was imagining it. Hunger does strange things to the mind. Fatigue turned shadows into stories. I stepped forward anyway, crossing the courtyard with careful footing, and entered the temple hall through the missing doors. Inside, the scent hit me immediately. Old wood, mold, cold stone, and underneath those, the faint sweetness of something spoiled, not rotting meat exactly, more like fruit left too long in a sealed jar, a syrupy, cloying decay that made the back of my tongue go numb. The hall was darker than the courtyard. My eyes had to adjust. I made out the shape of the altar, the low tables, the torn remnants of prayer banners clinging to beams like dead skin. A few half-melted candles stood as stumps. Someone had been here before me, not long ago, because there were footprints in the mud fresh enough that the edges hadn't softened completely. My stomach tightened. Eshuai wasn't far. This temple must have been used by travelers like me. Still, I didn't like the idea of company. Not tonight. Not in a place like this. I moved toward the side chamber, an area that might once have been used for storage or offerings, and found a patch of floor that looked dry enough to sit. I took off my damp outer robe and wrung it out, the water running down my arms in cold streams. My fingers were stiff. When I flexed them, my knuckles cracked like small bones. I sat. In the moment my weight settled onto the stone, I heard it again. That chewing. This time, closer. Not in the hall behind it. I froze with one hand still gripping my robe. There was a door at the back of the main chamber, half hanging from one hinge, leading to what might have been a rear courtyard or a priest's quarters. The darkness beyond it felt thicker than the rest of the hall. It didn't reflect even the faint moonlight. The sound came from there. Slow, rhythmic, wet. Chew. Pause. Chew. As if something had all the time in the world. I held my breath and listened. A strange thing happens when you listen hard enough. Your imagination fills in shape where there is none. The sound stopped being just chewing. It became appetite. It became intention. It became a mouth that knew what it was doing. My mind tried to protect itself by offering explanations. An animal. A stray dog gnawing on something. A traveler eating quietly in the dark. But my body didn't believe those explanations. My skin had begun to prickle. The hair at the back of my neck rose slowly, as if pulled upward by invisible thread. I should have left, but it was raining. I was exhausted, and I was ashamed of being frightened by a sound. So I did what scholars often do when frightened. I tried to reason it away. I stood, quietly, and walked to the altar table where a candle stump leaned. I fished in my pouch for flint. My fingers trembled just enough to make the stones click wrong twice. On the third strike, sparks caught the wick. A small flame bloomed. It wasn't much, but light has a way of making courage feel less like a story you're telling yourself. I held the candle up and approached the back door. The chewing had stopped again. I reached the threshold. The candle flame bent sideways, not from wind, but as though something had drawn breath nearby. The smell grew stronger, sweet rot, damp earth, something like old tea left to sour. I lifted the candle higher and stepped through. Behind the temple hall was a narrow passage leading to a smaller chamber, what might have once been a sleeping room. There were broken shelves, a rotted mat, a collapsed window frame, and on the floor, in the center of the room, there was an offering bowl. It was filled, not with fruit, not with coins, not with incense, with teeth, dozens of them, human teeth, yellowed, cracked, some still stained with dark roots. The candlelight caught on enamel and made them shine like wet pebbles. A few were still stuck together by dried blood and gum. My stomach lurched so violently I nearly dropped the candle. I staggered back, breathing through my mouth to avoid the smell, but it didn't help. The air tasted wrong here, thick, as if I'd stepped into someone else's breath. I forced myself to look away from the bowl, to scan the room for signs of a prank, some horrible bandit ritual. Anything that made this human. That was when I saw the footprints. They circled the bowl. Bare footprints, toes long and splayed, pressed into the damp dust. They didn't look like a normal man's feet. Too thin, too deep, like the bones were heavy. And the strangest part, there were no prints leading out, only in a ring around the offering bowl, as if something had come here and stayed. My candle flickered. In the corner of the room, beyond the shelves, there was a shadow that didn't match the shape of anything. It was too solid, too still. A person-sized darkness, crouched low, as if hugging its knees. I felt my chest constrict. I couldn't move. I couldn't even swallow. The shadow shifted, not like a person standing, like a mouth opening. And from inside it came a sound that was so quiet, it was almost gentle. A chew, just one, slow, deliberate, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. The candle flame trembled violently, and then just as suddenly the shadow was gone, not darting away, not retreating, gone as if the room had never contained it. I stood there with my throat locked and my mind screaming at my body to run. But my body did not run. My body did something else. Something stupid and deeply human. It tried to make meaning. I backed out of the chamber, closing the half door with a shaking hand, and returned to the main hall, as if stepping back into a safer reality would erase what I had seen. I sat down hard in the side chamber. My pulse hammered. My skin felt too tight. I stared at the candle until wax dripped onto my fingers, burning me enough to make me flinch. That pain helped. It reminded me I was still alive. I wrapped my arms around my knees, listening. There was no chewing now. Only rain. Only wind. I told myself it had been a trick of shadow and candlelight, that the teeth were animal teeth, that someone had dumped them there, long ago, and the footprints were mine, distorted by fear. But I knew the truth. There had been something in that room, something hungry. And hunger, I realized, was not always loud. Hunger could be patient. Hunger could sit in the dark and chew very slowly, savoring what it had stolen. I tried to sleep. At first, I almost managed it. Exhaustion is a strong rope. It pulls you downward no matter how tightly you hold yourself up. My eyes closed. My breathing slowed. Then I heard it. Not chewing. Voices. Muted. As if coming from underwater. At first, it sounded like the wind moving through broken beams. Then it gathered shape, syllables, cadence, the rise and fall of speech. My eyes snapped open. The candle had nearly burned out. The hall beyond the side chamber was a pool of darkness. But from that darkness, voices continued to murmur in a low, steady rhythm, like men reading from scrolls. And then came a sound that didn't belong in a ruined temple. A wooden block struck against stone. Once, twice, a quartz call for silence. My breath turned to frost in my throat, because I recognized that sound. I had studied law texts. I had copied court records. I knew the rituals of judgment. What I was hearing wasn't travelers. It wasn't bandits. It was the trial. And the strangest part wasn't that it was happening here, at night, in a place abandoned to weeds and rot. The strangest part was that the voices didn't sound human anymore. They sounded like something imitating humans, careful with the words, wrong with the warmth. A clerk's voice rose from the darkness, clear enough now that I could catch fragments. The case of the border town, the matter of stolen fortune, the count of mouths. Then, behind that voice, something deeper moved. Something heavy shifting on a throne, a low growl of wood under weight. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to cover my head. I wanted to pretend I was deaf. Instead, I leaned forward, trembling, drawn by a curiosity that felt like a curse. The murmur sharpened into a chant of names, not names of gods, not names of saints, names of people. I heard a name that might have been mine, or might have been close enough to make my blood go cold. And then, in the dark beyond the altar, came a sound like a mouth smiling, not chewing. Not yet. A voice spoke slow, resonant, like stone grinding against stone. It was not loud, but every syllable landed with authority, as if the temple itself had to listen. "Bring forth the magistrate," the voice said. My stomach dropped, because Heshui's magistrate was famous in these borderlands. The locals praised him like a miracle. They said he was generous. They said he fed the poor. They said his judgments were fair. They said even the bandits avoided Heshui now. because the magistrate's eyes saw through lies. And that was what people said. But what the voice said next made the candle flame shrink to a trembling dot. "Bring forth the one who wears virtue," it murmured, "and eats the town from the inside." And from somewhere in the darkness behind the altar, I heard it again. That slow, wet chewing, closer than before, as if the trial had noticed I was listening, as if it had opened its mouth, and I, poor scholar, soaked and starving, had unknowingly stepped into a courtroom that did not belong to the living. By the time the rain eased into a tired drizzle, morning had already begun to show its face, thin, gray, reluctant. It wasn't sunlight that woke me. It was the taste in my mouth, a sweetness, rotten at the edges, like overripe fruit that had been crushed and left in a bowl overnight. I sat up too fast, my spine popping, and for a moment the ruined temple tilted around me as if it were afloat. My candle had burned down to a puddle of wax. The hall lay quiet, emptied of voices, emptied of that courtroom murmur, as if the whole thing had been a fever dream stitched together by hunger and cold. But the smell hadn't left. It clung to the walls. It clung to my sleeves. It was in my hair when I rubbed my scalp and felt damp strands between my fingers. I tried to breathe through my mouth and only tasted it more. I forced myself to stand, to gather my pouch, to smooth my robe, as if appearance still meant anything in a place like this. The courtyard stones were pale with rainwater. The faceless statue watched me without eyes, and for a terrible second I imagined its blank head turning just slightly to follow my movement. Nothing moved, only the weeds, shivering in the breeze. Still, as I stepped toward the broken wall that served as an exit, I found myself looking back at the rear chamber at that half-hung door. Closed now, quiet now, but I could not shake the certainty that something behind it was still sitting there in the dark. Mouth working slowly, patiently, chewing on a flavor only it could taste. I did not bow. I did not offer incense. I did not whisper a prayer. I left. The road to Heshui was shorter than I had believed. Perhaps the night and fear had stretched it, pulled it thin the way nightmares do. In daylight, the borderlands looked less like a world haunted and more like a world forgotten scrubgrass, damp clay, low hills that seemed to crouch under the weight of cloud. Once or twice I passed old stone markers with characters eroded almost smooth. Once I passed a dead fox in a ditch, its fur soaked to dark, its eyes half open like it was still watching. I kept walking, and as I walked, the sound began again. Not loud, not obvious. At first it was just rhythm, a soft, wet cadence that seemed to fall between the beats of my own footsteps, like someone behind me matching my pace with a mouth instead of feet. Chew. Pause. Chew. I stopped abruptly. The sound stopped too. A cold sweat bloomed under my arms. I told myself it was only my imagination that last night had planted a seed in my mind, and now my mind was watering it with panic. I tightened my pouch strap and continued forward, deliberately changing my pace, making my steps uneven. The chewing changed with me. It wasn't following me. It was inside the air, inside the listening spaces between sound. When the first rooftops of Heshui came into view, I almost laughed from relief. Almost. The town sat in a shallow valley where two streams met. From a distance, it looked like any small settlement. Low buildings, a central street, smoke curling from chimneys. But there was something too neat about it. Not prosperous, exactly. Just arranged, like someone had taken care to keep the town from appearing desperate. As I entered, I noticed the little things first. Doorways had red paper charms pasted above them. Fresh ones, their ink bold and dark. A few small offerings sat on thresholds, bowls of rice, cups of tea, sometimes a little stack of coins. Not the careful, reverent offerings of a temple, more like payment, a tax of fear. The townspeople moved about their morning tasks with faces that wore polite expressions too tightly. They smiled quickly when they saw a stranger, but the smiles did not reach the eyes. A woman rinsing vegetables in a basin paused when I passed, her hands still in the water, her gaze following me as though she was trying to measure how long I might last in this place. A man carrying a bundle of firewood kept his head down, as if the sky itself might be watching. And then there was the smell. It wasn't everywhere, Not exactly. Heshui smelled like wet wood and cooking porridge, like animals and damp earth, like any town, but every so often near a certain doorway, beside a certain alley, at the corner where two streets met. The air would thicken with that same spoiled sweetness from the temple, a breath of rot hiding inside normal life. My stomach clenched. I stopped at a noodle stall, drawn by steam and the sound of boiling water. The stall owner was an old man with a face carved by wind and years. His hands moved quickly, practiced. When he looked up at me, his eyes flicked over my closed cheap scholar's robe, mud-stained hem, ink-stained fingers, and his expression softened into something close to pity. "You've come a long way," he said. His voice was gentle, but his eyes kept darting toward the main street, as if expecting someone. I nodded. "Is this Heshui?" The old man's smile twitched. "It is. Sit. Warm yourself." I sat on the bench, my legs shaking slightly from fatigue. The steam smelled heavenly garlic, broth, a hint of pepper. My mouth flooded. I realized with sudden embarrassment that I was practically trembling with hunger. The old man set a bowl in front of me without asking for payment. "Eat," he murmured. "You look like you've been on the road too long." I didn't argue. I lifted the chopsticks and began to eat. And for a brief, almost holy moment, the world narrowed to noodles and heat and the sensation of food becoming strength. Then, as I swallowed, I noticed something. The broth had a faint sweetness underneath the salt, a hint of overripe fruit. My hand paused midair. The old man watched me carefully. His gaze was too sharp for his gentle voice. "It tastes different," I said slowly, trying to sound casual. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Don't say that too loudly." My skin prickled. "Why?" His eyes flicked again toward the street. "Because this town is very blessed." Blessed. The word fell like a stone in my stomach. I swallowed and forced another bite. The sweetness grew more noticeable the longer I ate, like a flavor trying to reveal itself once my tongue adjusted. Around me, other customers ate in silence. No laughter, no chatter, only the quiet sounds of chewing and swallowing. And beneath that, if I listened too hard, chew, pause, chew, not from mouths, from somewhere deeper. I set down my chopsticks. The old man's gaze sharpened. "You're a scholar?" "Yes," I said. "I'm looking for work, copying texts, teaching." His face tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Then you'll want to see the magistrate." I hesitated. "Is he hiring?" The old man's mouth formed a smile that looked like a muscle spasm. He always has use for educated men. There was something wrong in the way he said use. I wiped my mouth and reached for my pouch. "How much?" He waved his hand quickly, almost violently. "No. Keep your money. Consider it hospitality." Then he leaned closer, his breath smelling faintly of tea leaves. "But listen to me, scholar. If you go to the magistrate's hall, be respectful, be grateful, and if he offers you food..." He stopped. His eyes widened as if he'd almost said something that could kill him. I followed his gaze. A group of men were walking down the street toward the stall. They wore clean uniforms, not fancy but well-maintained. Their boots were polished. Their hair was tied neatly. They looked like officials. Minor ones, clerks, guards. But the thing that made my throat tighten was their faces. They were smiling, all of them. The same smile, the same shape, like a mask copied from one man to another. The noodle stall owner straightened so quickly his bench creaked. His hands began wiping the counter in frantic strokes, as if cleanliness could protect him. The officials stopped at the stall. The one in front, a thin man with pale skin, looked at me like he was tasting me with his eyes. "A traveler," he said, voice smooth. "Welcome to Heshui." His smile didn't move when he spoke. The stall owner bowed. "Honored, sirs." The official's gaze remained on me. "What brings you here?" I forced myself to smile back. "Work. I'm a scholar." "Ah." The official nodded slowly, as if pleased. "Then the magistrate will wish to meet you." I felt my skin go cold. "Is that so?" He leaned closer, close enough that I could smell that spoiled sweetness on his breath. Our magistrate cherishes talent. He feeds the town. He protects the town. He brings fortune. Behind him, the other officials stood in perfect stillness, their smiles fixed. Their eyes were wide and bright, like eyes that had forgotten how to blink. And, the man continued, voice almost tender, the magistrate hates waste. Waste. The word struck like a gavel. I remembered the voices in the temple, the court, the deep, resonant voice calling for the magistrate to be brought forth. I swallowed, my throat tight. I will present myself, I said. The official's smile widened slightly. Good. Then he turned to the stall owner. He has eaten? The old man bowed again, sweat shining on his forehead. Yes, honored sir. Then the magistrate's blessing has reached him already. The official's eyes flicked back to me. You'll feel it soon. Next dawn. A chill crawled up my spine. Feel what? The official's expression softened into something almost pitying. The fullness. Then he laughed. It was a small laugh. Polite, almost human. But beneath it, I heard it clearly a sound like wet cloth being chewed. Chew. Pause. Chew. The officials moved on as their footsteps faded. The noodle stall fell silent. No one spoke. Even the water stopped boiling, as if the fire had decided to hide. The stall owner slumped slightly, his hands shaking. What is wrong with this town? I whispered. He didn't answer immediately. He stared at the steam rising from the pot like he expected it to form words. Finally, he said, very softly, do you know what a hungry ghost is? My mouth went dry. A spirit that starves. He nodded. A mouth that cannot be filled. A throat that cannot swallow enough. I remembered the bowl of teeth in the temple. The footprints, circling it like devotion. The old man continued, voice barely audible. They come when the boundary between worlds thins. They come when greed rots the heart. They come when a man eats not only food, but fortune. I stared at him. Fortune? He gave a miserable smile. Eshway used to be poor. Crops failed. Bandits robbed us. Children died in winter. His eyes glistened. Then the magistrate arrived. The way he said arrived made it sound like a storm. He promised order, the old man whispered. He promised food, and he delivered. Bandits disappeared. Grain stores filled. Everyone had enough to eat. I felt my breath catch. That sounds like a blessing. The old man's gaze sharpened suddenly. Yes, that's what we thought. His fingers gripped the edge of the counter so hard his knuckles whitened. But blessings always cost something. And when you don't know what you're paying, you don't notice the debt until it's too late. My stomach churned. What debt? He didn't answer with words. Instead, he pointed subtly, with a twitch of his chin toward a house across the street. A woman stood in the doorway there, holding a child. She smiled brightly at someone passing. Too brightly. Her eyes were ringed with exhaustion. The child in her arms stared blankly ahead, expression empty. And in the woman's other hand, half hidden behind her skirt, was a small offering bowl. Inside it, I saw something pale. At first I thought it was rice. Then the light shifted, and I realized it was teeth. I recoiled, my hand flying to my mouth. The stall owner's voice came like a funeral prayer. We give what we can, so the hunger stays satisfied. My heart hammered. You mean the magistrate? No. The old man's eyes widened in fear. Don't say it. He leaned closer. In this town, walls listen, doors listen, even bowls listen. A memory hit me. The faceless statue in the temple, staring without eyes, the candle flame bending as though something inhaled nearby. Listening, I lowered my voice. Why don't you leave? The old man laughed, softly joyless. Leave? With what? The magistrate's fortune follows us. It sticks to us. His eyes flicked to my bowl. You ate. Now it's on you too. My skin prickled. What do you mean? He didn't answer. He looked at me with a kind of sorrow that made my chest ache. Then he said quietly, if you go to the magistrate's hall, don't accept anything that looks like kindness. Kindness is the hook. I swallowed hard. but I need work. His gaze hardened. Then work may be the bait. I stood slowly, legs unsteady. The town seemed suddenly narrower, the air heavier. Smiles flashed from doorways. People bowed politely. Children watched with two still faces, and in the spaces between normal sounds, between footsteps, between birdsong, between breath, chew, pause, chew. My hand shook as I adjusted my pouch. "Where is the magistrate's hall?" The old man lifted a trembling finger and pointed up the main street. "Follow the red lanterns." I looked. Sure enough, along the street, red lanterns hung at regular intervals. Not festive, not warm. They looked like beads of blood strung through the town, guiding you towards something waiting at the end. I began to walk. The drizzle returned, gentle as breath. The lantern swayed slightly, and with each step, I felt something strange in my belly, not hunger, not fullness, but a subtle pulling sensation, like a thread had been tied inside me, and someone ahead was slowly winding it in. I tried to ignore it, but the further I walked, the stronger it became. A warmth in the stomach that wasn't comfort, a swelling, a fullness, as if the bowl of noodles I'd eaten was still expanding inside me, growing heavier with each breath. I stopped, pressing a hand against my abdomen. It felt wrong, too solid. I forced myself forward again. The magistrate's hall rose at the end of the street, a compound of clean walls and carved gates, far grander than any other building in Heshwi. The roof tiles were new. The stones at the entrance had been scrubbed so well they gleamed wetly in the rain. Guards stood on either side, faces neutral, but their eyes were bright. Too bright, as if they had been polished from the inside. As I approached, one guard stepped forward. "Scholar," he said, voice polite. "You are expected." My mouth went dry. "Expected?" He smiled faintly. "The magistrate knows many things." The gate opened, without being touched, just swung inward, as if welcoming me. I stepped through. Inside the courtyard, the air was warmer. The rain seemed to hesitate at the threshold, as though it didn't dare enter. A scent of incense drifted sweet, thick, clinging. Beneath it, faintly, that same spoiled sweetness. I followed a servant down a corridor lined with painted panels of prosperity. Wheat fields, fat fish, smiling families. The paintings were too vivid. The eyes in them seemed to shine with wet life. My stomach churned with that unnatural fullness. At the end of the corridor, the servant stopped before a set of doors carved with intricate scenes, not of gods, of mouths, mouths eating fruit, mouths eating grain, mouths eating meat, mouths open in endless hunger. The servant bowed. "Enter." "Blinds." I hesitated. From inside, I heard it. Soft, wet, rhythmic. Chew. Pause. Chew. The servant's head remained lowered, but his voice became strangely flat, like something reciting a line it had been taught. "Do not keep the magistrate waiting. He hates waste." My hand reached for the door, and as my fingers touched the carved wood, I felt it clear as a pulse. The door was warm, like living flesh, like something breathing behind it. The moment the door swung inward, the warmth hit me like breath from a crowded room, sweet with incense and something thicker beneath it, a syrupy rot that seemed to cling to the back of my throat the way cheap wine clings to the tongue. And I had the strange, irrational sensation that I wasn't stepping into a hall so much as into a mouth, into the inside of a creature that had learned to build walls and hang lanterns and call itself civilized. The room beyond the doors was larger than any chamber a border town magistrate should reasonably possess. Its beams lacquered, its floors polished to a mirror sheen that reflected lantern light in trembling puddles, and there were banners along the walls embroidered with blessings, prosperity, longevity, peace. Yet the characters on them looked subtly wrong, the strokes slightly too curved, as if they'd been written by a hand that had memorized the shape but never understood the meaning. Servants moved soundlessly across the floor, carrying trays, bowing without meeting my eyes, and the air seemed to press against my ears with a low hum, as though the hall itself was listening. I took 3 steps, and the fullness in my belly tightened. Not painful exactly, but possessive, like a hand closing around something soft inside me. And at the far end of the hall, beneath a canopy embroidered with a dragon swallowing its own tail, sat the magistrate, Lord Chiao. I later learned his surname, though the townspeople spoke it as though saying it too loudly might attract attention from the earth beneath their feet. He wore plain robes of dark green, unadorned except for a clasp at the throat shaped like a small, delicate mouth, and his face was handsome in a way that made the mind relax before it could question why. His skin pale and smooth, his hair tied neatly, his gaze steady, and his smile soft. Sympathetic was exactly the smile you would expect from a man praised for feeding the poor. Yet something in that smile unnerved me, because it seemed to arrive a fraction too late, like an echo following a sound, as if his face waited to see what expression I offered first before choosing the correct one to mirror. "Scholar," he said, and his voice was pleasant, almost musical, the kind of voice that could calm a crying child or settle a dispute with a few gentle syllables, but there was a wetness beneath the consonants. A slight pressure, as though the words had been passed through something soft and chewing before being released into the air. My mouth went dry, and I bowed low, feeling suddenly like a boy again, small and foolish, standing before authority that could stamp my future with a single decision. And when I straightened, the magistrate's gaze lingered on me in a way that felt intimate, not lustful, not even curious, but appraising like a cook, assessing the ripeness of fruit. "You've traveled far," he murmured, and he gestured with 2 fingers, delicate as chopsticks lifting a morsel, and at once a servant glided forward with a tray bearing a cup of tea, the steam rising in pale spirals that carried that faint, spoiled sweetness. The exact same scent I had tasted in the noodles, the exact same scent I had smelled in the ruined temple, and the fullness in my belly tightened again, as if my body recognized a familiar chain being tugged. I hesitated, but the magistrate's smile warmed, and in that warmth was a subtle pressure of expectation, the social trap of gratitude, the unspoken rule that refusal is insult, and before I could think my way out of it, my hands had reached, my fingers had wrapped around the cup, and the porcelain was warmer than it should have been, as if it had been held against living skin. I sipped, and the tea was excellent, deep, fragrant, with a taste like honeyed chrysanthemum, yet the sweetness lingered in a wrong way. Not floral, but fleshy, like fruit grown in darkness. And as it slid down my throat, the fullness inside me swelled so suddenly I nearly gasped, my hand reflexively pressing my abdomen, and for a heartbeat, I imagined something inside me shifting position, settling itself comfortably, as though it had been waiting for that sip to complete a ritual. The magistrate's gaze softened, and he nodded as if pleased with my reaction, as if he'd just watched a seed take root. "You look thin," he said gently, "and border roads are cruel. Eshui is not cruel." Then he lifted his hand, and servants appeared like thoughts. A low table set before me with a bowl of rice, steamed buns split open to release hot breath, slices of braised pork, glossy with sauce, pickled vegetables, bright as small jewels, and for a moment my body betrayed me completely, my hunger roaring up like an animal that had been chained too long, my mouth filling with saliva, my hands trembling, and I hated myself for it. Because I could see the trap. I could feel it. I could hear the old noodle seller's warning, kindness is the hook. Yet when the magistrate watched with that tender expression, when he said, "Eat, scholar. You cannot serve the world on an empty stomach," I began to eat as if my will belonged to someone else. The food was rich, too rich for a town like this. Every bite melting, every flavor precise, and after the 3rd mouthful, the fullness in my belly ceased to feel like food and began to feel like possession, as though my stomach were no longer a place that processed nourishment, but a room where something had taken a seat and was now spreading out comfortably, stretching its invisible limbs, and I had to stop, chopsticks hovering, because I realized the room had become very quiet, quiet in that unnatural way that happens when a crowd holds its breath to see what will happen next. When I looked up, I saw that the servants had stopped moving and were watching me from the edges of the hall with perfectly still faces, their eyes wide and reflective, their expressions polite yet hungry, like dogs trained to sit calmly while waiting for scraps. and behind them the officials I'd seen earlier stood in the shadows like folded paper figures, the same faint smiles on their lips. My throat tightened, and as if sensing my discomfort, the magistrate spoke again, voice smooth as silk, sliding over skin. "You must forgive my household. They admire scholarship. It is rare here." He leaned forward slightly, and I noticed then that his eyes were not quite the color I'd assumed up close. They held a faint amber sheen, like lacquer catching candlelight, and within that sheen there was movement, small and slow, as if something in the depth of his gaze was turning over, chewing. "Tell me," he continued, "what text do you favor?" I tried to answer like a scholar, naming classics, histories, moral treatises. But as I spoke, the words felt heavy, as if each sentence had to squeeze past a softness in my throat that did not belong to me. And every time I paused, the magistrate's attention sharpened, like a mouth pausing mid-chew to listen for the next sound. He asked about my home village, about my family, about my ambitions. And my answers spilled out too easily, unguarded, because his voice was honey and my mind was tired, and I began to feel the eerie sensation that the more I spoke, the lighter my head became, as though my words were not merely being heard, but being consumed, taken inside him, turned into something else. At one point I laughed softly at something he said, some gentle joke about the stubbornness of ink and the pride of brushstrokes, and the sound of my own laughter startled me, because it came out thin, as though I'd spent a year in silence. And in the same instant, I saw the magistrate's lips part, just briefly, and the gleam inside his mouth was wrong, not blood, not fangs, nothing theatrical, just a darkness that looked wet and deep, a darkness that suggested a throat leading down to something vast. And when his lips closed again, the smile returned, perfectly shaped, perfectly human. "You are talented," he said warmly, "and Heshwi needs men like you. I could employ you." My heart leaped, despite my fear, because poverty makes hope taste like salvation, and he watched that leap with quiet satisfaction, like a fisherman feeling the line tighten. "There is only one thing," he continued, "one small condition." The servants around us lowered their eyes. The officials in the shadows seemed to lean closer. Even the lantern flames appeared to still, as if afraid to flicker. The magistrate's voice softened into something almost intimate. "You must stay in Heshwe for one full cycle of the moon," he said. 30 days. Write for my office. Copy my records. Teach my clerks. At the end of 30 days, you may leave with silver enough to change your life. 30 days. The number landed in my mind like a stone dropped into water, ripples spreading outward in panic, because I remembered the temple voices, the court of the underworld, the phrase the clerk had spoken, the count of mouths, and suddenly I could not shake the thought that this was not employment, but enrollment, not an offer but a sentence. I tried to smile and nod, but my lips felt stiff, and a cold sweat dampened my palms, because as the magistrate spoke of my future, I felt the fullness inside my belly shift again, like an animal turning in its sleep, and the simple truth became unavoidable. I could not leave. Not yet. Not after eating. Not after drinking. Not after letting his kindness pass my lips. "Is that acceptable?" he asked, and his smile held no threat, no obvious cruelty. Yet the question felt like a rope placed gently around my neck, and I heard, faintly, somewhere in the hall a wet, rhythmic sound, quiet enough to be mistaken for silk rubbing against silk, but steady as heartbeat. Chew. Pause. Chew. My mind scrambled, searching for polite refusal, for a way to decline without insult, but every path I imagined ended with guards blocking the gate, ended with smiles tightening into something sharp, ended with a bowl of teeth in the temple and the idea of payment. "Yes," I heard myself say, and the moment the word left my mouth, a wave of warmth passed through my chest, as if something inside me had just been fed a promise. The magistrate's eyes gleamed. "Wonderful," he whispered. Then he clapped his hands once, softly, and servants flowed forward again, bowing, speaking congratulatory phrases, and among the offerings brought to seal the agreement was a small lacquered box presented to me with both hands by a young attendant whose face was too pale and whose smile looked practiced. "A token," the magistrate said, "to welcome you. A sign that Heshue provides for those who serve." The box was light in my hands, and when I opened it, I found inside a single item, a coin, old and dark, with a hole in its center. The kind of coin a child might find in river mud and keep as treasure, except this coin was warm as skin, and on one side of it was carved a character that resembled Fortune, but with one extra stroke that made it look like a mouth. I stared at it, and the fullness in my belly tightened so sharply I almost doubled over, and in that tightening I felt a tug, a pull, as if the coin was not merely a gift but a hook that had found its place. The magistrate watched me with serene satisfaction. "Keep it close," he said gently. "It will protect you. Heshue is generous, but the borderlands are full of hungry things." His smile deepened. "You wouldn't want anything hungry to mistake you for food," and as he spoke those last words, the servants bowed lower. The lantern flames flickered again as if released from fear, and I finally understood what the town had been from the moment I entered. Not a community, not a refuge, but a well-fed trap, a place where hunger had dressed itself in silk and called itself mercy. A place where smiles were not expressions but disguises. And the most terrifying part was not that the magistrate was inhuman, not that he consumed Fortune like a beast in the dark, but that he had made the townspeople complicit in the feeding, not through force alone but through comfort, through full bowls and warm roofs, and the human desperation to believe that a blessing cannot possibly be a mouth. By the time I was led to my assigned room, clean, fragrant, with fresh bedding and a brazier glowing softly in the corner, I felt as though the hall had swallowed me and set me down gently in its belly, and when the door closed behind me with a soft click, I sat on the bed and tried to breathe, but every inhale tasted faintly of honeyed rot. Every exhale sounded too loud in the quiet, and when I pressed my hand to my abdomen, I felt not emptiness, not nourishment, but something round and patient beneath the skin. Something that pulsed once, slowly, like a satisfied throat working through a meal. And far away in the compound, deep behind walls painted with prosperity, I heard it again, steady as law, steady as ritual, the sound of chewing in the dark. As if somewhere in Heshue, someone was always eating, and the town, like a bowl held out to the underworld, was always being emptied and refilled, until nothing of the original flavor remained. Morning in the magistrate's compound arrived without birdsong, without the usual messy argument of life beginning again, and that should have been my first clear warning, 'cause even the poorest villages have chickens. Even the loneliest roads have crows. But here, inside these clean walls, where prosperity was painted onto wood and stone, the air remained unnaturally disciplined, as if every living thing had been trained to move quietly, so as not to disturb something sleeping beneath the floorboards. I woke, with the taste of sweet rot still lingering on my tongue, and with it the sensation that my stomach was not empty, despite having eaten nothing since the banquet. That same oppressive fullness sitting inside me like a warm stone, like a hand cupping my organs from the inside. And when I sat up, the room's neatness felt almost aggressive. Bed made, brazier already fed, a wash basin of warm water waiting as if someone had been standing outside the door all night listening for the moment I began to breathe differently. The old coin rested on the small table where I'd placed it, and in the dim dawn it seemed to catch light without any source, faintly gleaming, faintly alive, and when my fingers brushed it, the warmth jumped into my skin like a pulse finding a vein. I told myself it was only metal holding heat from yesterday, only superstition clinging to exhaustion, but the moment I withdrew my hand, the fullness in my belly tightened in response, as if the coin and whatever sat inside me were connected by an invisible tendon, and I found myself swallowing hard, forcing my mind into order the way a poor scholar always does, when fear threatens to undo him. I am here. I need work. I will keep my head low. I will serve 30 days. I will leave with silver. Nay, I will never return. A servant arrived with breakfast before I had finished washing rice porridge, salted egg, steamed buns that breathed hot sweetness when torn open, and I stared at the food with a sudden nausea because the smell carried that same honeyed decay beneath the surface. But the servant's smile was gentle and trained, and behind him stood 2 guards with polished boots, perfectly still. So I ate, because refusal in this place felt like shouting, and as the warm porridge slid down my throat, the fullness inside me softened with pleased relief. Like something shifting into a more comfortable position, I was led through corridors that seemed brighter than yesterday, yet somehow colder, past panels of painted abundance that now looked less like blessings and more like instructions. Fat fish, bursting grain, peaches split open to reveal glistening flesh, and I noticed details I'd missed before. The mouths and the brushstrokes, tiny and hidden, the way a peach pit was shaped like a tooth, the way wheat stalks curved like tongues. The clerk's office sat near the inner courtyard, a long room filled with shelves and scrolls, and the moment I stepped inside, I smelled ink good, ink rich and sharp, but underneath it lay something sour and animal, the faint odor of sweat trapped in paper. And the clerks at the desks lifted their heads in unison, their faces too smooth, their eyes too bright, their smiles faintly identical, as if they'd all been trained on the same expression, like a uniform. "Scholar," the chief clerk said, bowing politely, "we have been instructed to make your duties light at first." And he placed before me a stack of ledgers bound in dark cloth, their covers stamped with the character for fortune. Except again, that extra stroke that made it resemble a mouth. And the chief clerk's fingers lingered on the stamp in a way that felt reverent, almost hungry, before he withdrew his hands and gestured to my seat. I sat, dipped my brush, and began to copy his ordered names, dates, grain tallies, tax records, donations gifted to the magistrate for his generosity. And at first, the work soothed me, because routine has always been my sanctuary. The straight lines of characters like fences holding chaos back. But after a few pages, my eyes began to sting and water, because the ink on the ledger did not remain ink. It darkened as it dried, becoming less like black pigment and more like something that had once been inside a living body. And when I leaned closer, I caught a faint metallic scent, not strong enough to prove anything, only strong enough to make my stomach roll. And the strangest part was that the numbers seemed to shift. I would copy 25 sacks of rice and glance back to confirm and find 24, then 23, the figures thinning, as though something were nibbling them off the paper, and when I blinked hard, the numbers returned to normal, leaving me unsure whether I'd imagined the change or whether the ledger itself was playing with my sight the way hunger plays with the mind. I forced myself to continue, and the office filled with the soft scratch of brushes, a sound that should have been calming. Yet the rhythm of it began to resemble the chewing I'd heard in darkness. Wet strokes, pauses, wet strokes until my skin prickled, and I had to swallow down panic. And the chief clerk brought me another set of documents near midday, and as he slid them across the table, his sleeve lifted just enough for me to see the underside of his wrist, where a faint pattern of bruising circled the skin like a bracelet, the color of old fruit. And embedded in that bruising so subtle I almost missed it was the imprint of tiny teeth marks, as though someone had bitten his luck directly out of his blood. I stared too long, and his sleeve dropped instantly, his smile tightening for the first time into something warning, and I realized the room had gone quiet again, the other clerks watching me with their bright, hungry eyes, waiting to see if I would speak. I lowered my gaze, my pulse thundering, and returned to the paperwork. But now the words on the pages crawled under my attention like insects, and the more I read, the more I understood what these records truly were. Not a town ledger, not governance, but a menu. Each household name was listed beside subtle marks, small circles and strokes that looked like clerical shorthand, until I noticed their pattern. One mark for healthy, another for fortunate, another for many children, another for young bride, another for ancestral land, and beside some names, the marks were crossed out in red as if something had already been taken. My mouth went dry as I traced the list with trembling eyes, families I'd seen on the street. The noodle stall owner, the woman with the child, and the tooth bowl. And beside their names were fewer marks now than there should have been. as if their fortune had been steadily subtracted, eaten down to bone. I tried to stop thinking, tried to focus on copying, but then a new sound rose from the hall outside the office. Light footsteps, a murmur of greeting, and the clerks all sat a little straighter, their smiles returning like masks snapped into place. And when I glanced up, I saw him through the doorway. Magistrate Chow walking slowly past the corridor, hands behind his back, robes whispering, his face serene, his gaze drifting over the office like sunlight moving across a field. The moment his presence neared, the sweetness in the air intensified, and inside my belly the warm stone shifted with eager anticipation, and I felt a terrifying tug like a leash tightening, pulling my attention toward him. The magistrate paused at the doorway, looked inside, and his eyes found me immediately, as if he'd been tasting the room and my flavor had stood out. And he smiled with that soft, human gentleness that made it difficult to accuse him of anything, even in my own mind. "Scholar," he said, and his voice slipped into my ears like warm tea. "Are you settling in?" I bowed too quickly, my forehead almost striking the table, and as I lifted my head, I saw the chief clerk's knuckles whiten around his brush, as if he were holding himself still by force. "Yes, my lord," I said, and my voice sounded wrong, thinner, quieter like a candle wick after being pinched. The magistrate's gaze remained on me, and in that gaze I sensed not cruelty but appetite so refined it had learned to wear kindness as a scent. And he stepped into the room, slow and effortless, the clerks shrinking inward like plants bending away from too bright sun. He walked behind me, and when he stopped at my shoulder, the sweetness in the air became unbearable, filling my nose, coating my throat, and I felt my belly clench hard, like something inside me had opened its mouth. The magistrate leaned closer, his lips near my ear, and I heard it clearly now beneath his breathing, a faint wet clicking sound, like saliva drawn between teeth. "Your handwriting," he murmured, "is steady. That steadiness is rare." His fingers touched the ledger page lightly, not yet pointing, simply resting, yet the paper beneath his fingertips seemed to darken as if absorbing oil, and the inked characters trembled on the surface like frightened insects. "Do you see," he whispered, "how a town lives by numbers?" My throat tightened. "Yes, my lord." He smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes this time. "Numbers," he continued softly, "are like rice, meant to be counted, meant to be consumed." Then his fingertips slid down the ledger, tracing a line of names, and wherever he traced, the characters faintly blurred, as though being licked away. A wave of dizziness washed over me, not from fear alone, but from something deeper, something bodily, because, as he traced those names, I felt the fullness inside me respond, pulsing with slow pleasure. And with that pulse came images that were not mine. A child's laughter, fading, a mother's wedding ring losing shine, a man's strong back bending under invisible weight, the taste of joy turning thin as broth stretched too far. I gripped my brush so hard my fingers cramped, my nails digging into skin, trying to anchor myself to pain, to reality, and the magistrate's voice brushed my ear like velvet. "Eshui survives," he murmured. "Eshui prospers, but prosperity must be managed." His hand withdrew, and with it the oppressive sweetness eased just slightly, like a mouth closing after tasting something. "You will help me manage it," he said. My heart pounded. "How?" I whispered before I could stop myself, and instantly the room went colder, the clerk's eyes widening, the chief clerk's face draining of color as if I'd spoken a forbidden name. The magistrate turned his head slowly to look at me, and for a moment the kindness fell away like a curtain caught by wind, revealing something underneath, something ancient, patient, endlessly hungry. Then the curtain settled again and the smile returned. "By writing," he said gently, "by recording truth." His fingers lifted my lacquered coin from the table beside my inkstone without asking, and the moment he touched it, the coin warmed visibly, as if heated from within, and the fullness in my belly tightened in painful recognition. He placed the coin in my palm and closed my fingers around it, pressing just firmly enough that I felt the imprint of its edges on my skin like teeth. "Keep it close," he whispered. "It helps you understand." Then, with the same calm grace, he left the office. And as he walked away, the clerks exhaled as one, shoulders slumping like puppets whose strings had loosened. I sat trembling, staring at the ledger in front of me, because now, under the faint smear where his finger had traced, the ink no longer looked like ink at all. It looked like dried blood, and beneath one household name, a new mark had appeared that I had not written, a small circle drawn like an open mouth, and inside it, in red, was a number 30, and when I blinked, the number remained, pulsing faintly like a wound. My stomach lurched as understanding finally took shape in my mind, sharp and undeniable. The 30 days were not simply a contract, not a test of loyalty, but a feeding cycle, a lunar measure of appetite. And I, because I had eaten, because I had accepted kindness, because I had let the hook enter my body, had been registered like grain in the storehouse, like meat in brine, counted among the town's mouths. And when I looked down at my wrist in the dim office light, I saw, just below the sleeve line, a faint bruised ring forming on my skin, the color of old fruit, the shape of tiny teeth. That night I could not eat, even though a servant placed a tray of supper in my room with the same polite smile and the same fragrant steam that promised comfort, because the moment I lifted the lid, the sweetness rose like a living thing, and my stomach clenched with a hunger that felt wrong, too eager, too deep, as if it wasn't my hunger at all, but something inside me leaning forward with its mouth already open. I pushed the tray away, hands trembling, and the servant's smile did not falter. Yet his eyes lingered on my throat, on my belly, with a faint, disappointed shine, like a dog whose owner has refused to throw the bone. And when he left, the door clicked shut with finality that made my skin crawl, because I realized the compound did not close like a house closes. It sealed like a jar. I sat on the bed with the lacquered coin in my palm, turning it slowly, feeling its warmth seep into my skin. And the more I touched it, the more the world seemed to sharpen in unpleasant ways, as if the coin did not protect, but revealed my hearing grew too sensitive, picking up whispers behind walls, soft footfalls in courtyards, the faint scrape of brush on paper somewhere far away, and underneath all those ordinary sounds was the steady, wet rhythm that had haunted me since the temple. Chew, pause, chew. A sound not made by teeth alone, but by patience. I tried to sleep anyway because exhaustion is a tyrant, but every time I drifted close, the fullness inside my belly tightened and dragged me awake as if a leash had snapped taut. And when I pressed my ear to the door, I could hear someone standing on the other side, not breathing loudly, not shifting, simply present, waiting as though my wakefulness itself was being monitored. Near midnight, when even the lantern lights seemed to dim in deference to deeper dark, I rose and took out the ledger page I'd copied earlier, the one where the red 30 pulsed under that small mouth-shaped circle, and I stared at it until my eyes burned, and then very carefully I held the paper close to the brazier flame. The edge curled, blackened, and for a second relief surged through me like heat in winter, because the red mark began to blister, to warp, as if I were burning away the contract itself. But the instant the flame kissed the mouth-shaped circle, a sound burst from the paper, a thin, wet, choking shriek, not loud enough to wake the compound, but intimate enough to make my blood freeze, as though the page had a throat and I had placed it directly over fire. I yanked the paper back with a curse half swallowed, my heart hammering, and the burned edge smoked with a smell that was unmistakably bodily hair, old fat, charred sweetness, while the red mark remained unhurt, bright as fresh blood. And in that moment, I understood with sick clarity that these records were not merely ink and cloth. They were bindings, living documents anchored to something beneath the town, something that could not be destroyed by simple flame. My fingers shook as I smoothed the paper again, and the coin grew hotter in my palm, almost uncomfortably so, as if delighted by my fear, as if feeding on my realization. I needed answers, real answers, not the kind that scholars write in margins, but the kind that keep you alive. and the only person in this compound who looked human enough to break was the chief clerk. The man with tooth bruises hidden under his sleeves. The man whose knuckles whitened whenever Magistrate Chow entered like sunlight. I waited until the compound quieted into that deepest hour when even the guards seemed to become statues, then slipped out barefoot, robe wrapped tight, moving down corridors lit by red lanterns that painted everything the color of meat. And the strangest part was how easy it was. Doors that should have creaked did not. Floors that should have chilled my feet felt faintly warm. And I realized with dawning dread that the compound was letting me move, the way a fisherman lets a hooked fish swim in circles, tiring itself out. The clerk's office door was unlocked, waiting, and when I slid inside, I found the room exactly as it had been left. Desks aligned, brushes laid neatly, scrolls stacked like bones, and in the dim lantern light, the characters on the ledger's spines looked less like words and more like mouths shut tight. I moved quickly to the shelves and pulled out the records marked with the magistrate's seal, my fingers racing along cloth bindings until I found the earliest dated scrolls. The first year, Magistrate Chow arrived, and as I unrolled them, the ink shimmered faintly, like something wet, revealing lists of donations, blessings, grain increases, crime decreases, miraculous prosperity. Yet threaded through those triumphs were small notations written in a clerk's trembling hand. Unexpected deaths, elderly, healthy, and miscarriages 3 inches West Lane, and sudden forgetfulness. Mr. Han no longer recalls his son's name, and smiles too wide, laughter thin, and teeth offered at doors. My breath came shallow, and the fullness in my belly pulsed as if the thing inside me were pleased to be remembered, because the records became more explicit as they continued, no longer hiding behind numbers. Magistrate requests, payment during famine, 3 teeth per household, and new rule, offerings at thresholds, nightly, and then written in a different ink. Darker, older count of mouths must be maintained, or hunger spills. As I read that line, the lantern flame wavered, and the chewing sound in the compound grew louder, closer, as though the walls themselves had begun to gnaw. My pulse roared in my ears. I rolled out another scroll, hands damp, and found a section written like a confession rather than an account. We thought he was a man at first. We thought he was kind. He came with warm grain and warm smiles. He spoke of fairness. He offered food to the poor. He built storehouses. He made us feel safe. Then, the first winter, when the moon was thin, we heard the chewing under the hall like rats in grain. But there were no rats. It was hunger wearing a magistrate's face. It eats luck, eats years, eats names. It eats the sweet parts of a person until only duty remains. My throat constricted around the word names, because names are what scholars cling to. Names are legacy, proof you existed. And the moment that thought formed, I felt the coin burn my palm, and with it came a cold sensation sliding down my spine as if someone had spoken my name behind me. I turned slowly, and there in the doorway stood the chief clerk, pale in the lantern glow. His face drawn with exhaustion and fear so deep it looked like he'd been living inside it for years. He shut the door gently behind him without taking his eyes off me, and his voice came out in a whisper that scraped like dry brush. "You shouldn't read those," he said. I opened my mouth to demand answers, to accuse, to beg, but he lifted his hand sharply, silencing me, and I realized he wasn't afraid of the magistrate alone. He was afraid of the room listening. "Not loud," he murmured. "Not here." He stepped closer, and when he rolled up his sleeve, I saw the bruised ring of teeth around his wrist. Clearly now, a dark halo like spoiled fruit, and beneath it the skin looked strangely empty, as if something had been sucked out of him. "He does it slowly," the clerk whispered, "so you don't notice what you've lost." My voice shook. "What is he?" The clerk's eyes glistened. "A hungry ghost," he said, and the words carried an ancient bitterness. "Not the kind that wails in the street. The kind that learns law. The kind that learns smiles. The kind that eats fortune instead of flesh because fortune lasts longer." My stomach clenched with nausea, and the fullness inside me shifted in agreement as though recognizing its own description. "Why does he need the town?" I whispered. The clerk swallowed. Because hunger needs a bowl, he said. A place where it can be fed without being chased away by priests or gods. Heshui is his bowl. The people are the offerings. He looked down at my hand where the coin gleamed faintly. And you? His lips trembled. You've been marked. I forced my fingers open and stared at the coin, at that character that looked like fortune twisted into a mouth. How do I unmark myself? The clerk's laugh was soft and broken. You don't, he said. Not once you've eaten. My chest tightened. Then what do I die on the 30th day? The clerk shook his head slowly, horror deepening in his eyes. Worse, he whispered. You become useful. The lantern flame flickered, throwing shadows that looked like crouched shapes along the shelves, and the chewing sound seemed to rise from beneath the floorboards, steady as a heartbeat. On the 30th day, the clerk continued, he finishes the cycle. He seals what he has taken, and then he chooses whether you leave as a hollow man with silver in your pouch, no joy, no memory of home, or whether you stay as a clerk. He gestured to the room around us. We are not all born here, he said, voice trembling with shame. Some of us came like you, scholars, travelers, men who believed in kindness. The words hit me like ice. You mean? The clerk's eyes avoided mine. Yes, he whispered. I came with a brush and hunger in my belly, and he fed me. And I said yes, and now I cannot remember my mother's face. He pressed his fist against his mouth as if to keep something from leaking out. I write his records. I count his mouths. My throat tightened painfully. Then help me leave, I said. The clerk stared at me for a long moment, and in that silence, I realized he was weighing something heavier than fear. Hope. The most dangerous currency in Heshui. Finally, he nodded once, sharply. There is one way, he whispered. One cruel way. He reached into his robe and pulled out a small pouch, then poured its contents into his palm. Teeth. Human teeth. Worn smooth by handling, pale in lantern light like pebbles. My stomach lurched. Payment, he said. Not for him, for the court beneath him. I froze. Court. The clerk's voice dropped to a breath. The underworld court, he murmured. The one you heard in the temple. My skin went cold. You heard it too? His eyes widened. No, he said, but I know the sound of judgment. Every feeding cycle, on the night the moon disappears, the court counts its mouths. If the count is short, hunger spills into the town. If the count is full, the magistrate is allowed to remain. I felt my pulse hammer. Allowed by whom? The clerk's gaze flicked upward, as if the ceiling might open. By the king of 10,000 hells, he whispered, and the words tasted like ash. By the one who keeps order among the hungry. My hands shook. Then how do I leave? The clerk's jaw clenched. You must make the count full without using yourself, he said. You must give the court another mouth. My breath caught. Another person. The clerk's eyes shimmered with tears he did not allow to fall. Yes, he whispered. If you present a substitute at the right time, someone already hollow, someone already half-eaten, the court will accept them, and your mark will loosen. His voice broke. I can't do it, he whispered. I can't offer anyone else. I've already watched too many people smile as they emptied. I stared at him, trembling because the cruelty of the choice was its own form of hunger, and I realized this was how Magistrate Chow stayed clean. He didn't force you with chains. He forced you with impossible ethics, made survival taste like sin. Then there is no way, I whispered. The clerk grabbed my wrist suddenly hard, and I felt his fingers like cold iron. Listen, he hissed. If you try to run, the mark tightens. The coin drags you back. You'll walk in circles until your legs bleed. I've seen it. His grip trembled. If you fight him openly, you will disappear. There are cells beneath the hall that smell like honey and rot. Men go in and come out smiling. He released me, and his shoulders slumped like a man carrying stones. So choose, he whispered. Choose before the 30th night. His eyes lifted to mine. But know this, he said, voice barely audible. The court already knows your name. A chill ran through me. What do you mean? The clerk swallowed, and his lips moved like he was chewing a confession. Your name, he whispered. It was written before you arrived. My stomach turned. That's impossible. The clerk shook his head, eyes haunted. We think we walk into towns, he said, but sometimes towns have already walked into us. He reached toward the ledger I'd burned earlier, pulled it from my sleeve where I'd tucked it, and pointed to the mouth-shaped circle beside my name. Beneath the pulsing 30, there was faint writing I hadn't noticed before, as if the ink had been waiting for my eyes to learn how to see it. It was a line written in that older, darker ink. Summoned by hunger, entered willingly. My breath failed. I didn't. The clerk's voice cut through me like wind through broken doors. You ate, he whispered. That is willingness here. Then he stepped back and bowed slightly. The gesture automatic as breathing. I have said too much, he murmured. If you want a chance, go to the outer storehouse tomorrow at dawn. There is a back gate. It opens for deliveries. He paused at the door. But remember, he whispered, eyes wet. Heshway is not a town. His hand rested on the latch. It is a stomach. Then he slipped out, leaving me alone with the scrolls and the chewing under the floorboards that had grown louder now, urgent, as if the compound itself had started to wake and taste the air. I returned to my room before anyone could notice, but the corridors seemed longer, the lanterns redder, the shadows thicker. And when I reached my door, I found a bowl placed neatly in front of it. A small ceramic offering bowl, clean and waiting, and inside it lay a single tooth, fresh, still wet at the root. My knees nearly buckled, because no one had been there when I left. And yet the bowl sat as if it had been expecting payment from me specifically. And when I looked up at the roof beams, I felt, unmistakably, the sensation of being watched by something patient and pleased. Dawn came with the same unnatural silence, and I slipped out toward the storehouse with my heart in my throat, coin clenched in my fist, robe damp with sweat, and every step felt like walking through thick syrup, because the coin tugged subtly in the opposite direction, toward the magistrate's hall, toward the warm mouth of the compound. The outer storehouse stood near the back wall, stacked with grain sacks that smelled faintly sweet in that wrong way, and a delivery gate, plain wood, iron latch waited half open as if it truly might let me slip out into the borderlands and vanish. I stepped toward it, and for one glorious heartbeat the air beyond tasted like honest rain and mud, like freedom. But then the coin in my fist grew violently hot, burning into my skin, and the fullness inside my belly tightened with sudden hunger, and my vision swam as if someone had poured warm tea over my eyes. The world blurred, tilted, and when it steadied, I realized my feet were not moving forward anymore. They were moving sideways, turning, drifting back toward the compound's inner courtyard, as though guided by a leash tied to my organs. I fought it, gritting my teeth, forcing myself toward the gate, but the tug became pain-sharp, internal, like hooks catching on muscle, and I stumbled, gasping, because it felt as if the coin had roots inside me. Going somewhere, scholar? The voice came softly from behind, and my blood froze because it wasn't threatening. It wasn't angry, it was warmly amused, like a host watching a guest search for the exit at the end of a pleasant banquet. I turned slowly and saw Magistrate Kiao, standing at the edge of the storehouse shadows, hands folded, face serene, eyes shining with that faint amber lacquer, and beside him stood the officials with their identical smiles, their bright eyes reflecting lantern light though it was morning. "My lord," I stammered, bowing instinctively even as terror clawed my ribs. The magistrate's gaze drifted to the gate, then back to me, and the tenderness in his expression was almost unbearable because it made violence unnecessary. "The borderlands are cold," he said gently, "and you are new to Heshway." He stepped closer, and the sweetness thickened in the air. "You mustn't wander while you're still settling." I swallowed hard. I only wished to leave. He finished for me, still smiling. "Yes, that is a common wish." His voice lowered to something intimate. "But you misunderstand your situation." His fingers lifted slightly, and the coin in my fist pulsed with heat as if responding to its owner. "That token he murmured, was not a gift. My throat closed. Then what is it? The magistrate's smile widened just a fraction. A receipt, he said softly. A proof of payment. The word struck like a blade, because I realized horribly that I had not been paid by eating. I had been purchased. The magistrate's gaze slid over me like a tongue-tasting salt. You have a fine mind, he said, almost kindly. A mind is sweet. It ripens. The officials behind him smiled wider. The chewing sound rose from nowhere and everywhere under sacks, behind walls, inside my own breath. 30 days, the magistrate continued, is merely the time required to finish savoring. My skin went numb. Savoring what? I whispered. The magistrate leaned in, and for the first time his kindness cracked enough that I glimpsed what lay beneath not monstrous features, not fangs, but an emptiness so vast it made my bones ache, an emptiness shaped like endless appetite. Your luck, he whispered. Your years, his voice softened. Your name. I flinched at that last word as if struck. My name? The magistrate nodded gently, as though explaining a simple matter of law. Names are delicious, he said. They are the sweet part of a person, the part that stays. His lips parted slightly, and I heard the faint wet click again, like saliva drawn from teeth. You heard the court in the temple, he murmured. That was unfortunate, but perhaps it was always meant. My blood ran cold. I didn't mean to. Hush, he said, still gentle. In Hishwai, nothing is accidental. He straightened and gestured toward the gate, almost gracious. Go on, he said. Try again. My pulse pounded. I didn't understand. Try, he repeated. I turned, swallowed, and forced myself toward the gate again. Every step fueled by panic, yet the tug in my belly tightened until tears sprang into my eyes, and by the time I reached the threshold, the pain became unbearable. A hook dragging through my insides, and I collapsed to my knees, gasping, because the coin had become an anchor nailed into my flesh. Laughter not loud, not cruel, rose behind me. The magistrate's soft chuckle like warm tea spilled over ice. You see, he murmured, receipts cannot walk away. I knelt in mud and shame and terror, and I finally understood the deepest horror of Heshwi. It did not need chains. It did not need locked doors. It needed only kindness and hunger, and it would tie you from the inside. I was escorted back as politely as a guest, the officials guiding me with gentle hands, and as we passed through the courtyard, I saw townspeople beyond the wall, beginning their day smiling, bowing, carrying bowls, pretending not to see, and I wanted to scream at them, warn them. But when I opened my mouth, no sound came out, only a dry whisper as if my voice had been chewed thinner overnight. In my room, the supper tray waited again, freshly replaced, steam rising in patient spirals, and on the table beside it lay a new document with the magistrate's seal, ink still wet, an updated ledger page. My hand shook as I read it, because beside my name, the red 30 had been crossed out, and beneath it, written neatly, lovingly, was a new number, 1. I stared, confused, sick with relief that lasted only a heartbeat, because the line beneath it clarified the change in cold administrative script. Due to exceptional flavor, feeding cycle accelerated. My stomach clenched. The fullness inside me pulsed with pleased hunger. I backed away from the table, nausea rising. And that was when I noticed the mirror on the wall, polished bronze, clean, too clean, reflecting my face in the lantern glow. I stepped closer, desperate for something certain, and my reflection stared back, eyes wide, skin pale, but there was something missing. Something so subtle it took my mind a moment to name it. My mouth in the reflection was smiling, faintly, even though my lips were not. I raised my hand to cover my mouth, and the reflection raised its hand too, but the smile remained in the metal as if etched there, as if the mirror had decided what expression belonged to me now. A soft knock came at the door. Scholar, a servant called gently. The magistrate requests your presence for tonight's record. My throat tightened. Tonight? I whispered. The servant's voice remained politely warm. Yes, he said. The court will convene. The chewing sound rose beneath the floorboards, louder now, impatient. I stumbled back from the mirror, breath shaking, and the coin on the table glowed faintly like an ember. As the servant waited outside, I understood the final twist with the clarity of a blade. The 30 days had never been meant as time for me to escape. They had been meant as time for me to forget I ever wanted to. The hunger was not rushing because it feared losing me. Hunger never fears. It was rushing because I had become ripe, because my terror had sweetened me, because my name had been spoken in the underworld court, and the count of mouths required fulfillment. That night I was led through corridors lined with red lanterns that swayed as if breathing, and the magistrate's hall opened like a throat, warm and sweet, and as I knelt before Lord Chow's serene smile, I heard the wooden block strike stone once, twice, calling the court to silence. And from behind the altar, the darkness gathered like robes, like judges seated in shadow, and the clerk's voice rose wet, careful, imitating human law, reading names from a scroll that sounded like it was being licked as it was spoken. My name came last, and when it was read, the coin in my pocket burned like a brand, my belly tightened like a mouth opening, and I realized with a sick calm that the magistrate had been right. Nothing here was accidental. Not even my arrival, not even my hunger that first night, because long before I stepped into the ruined temple, long before I tasted noodles, my name had already been written as a meal. The last thing I remember clearly is the magistrate's hand lifting my chin with gentle fingers, his eyes kind as candlelight, and his voice murmuring as though offering comfort. "Don't be afraid, scholar. This will not hurt." Then the chewing sound filled the room, soft, reverent, like a congregation eating communion. And my thoughts began to thin, my memories loosening like ink washed by rain. And somewhere far away, beyond the compound walls, Eshui's townspeople continued their lives with careful smiles, bowls on doorsteps, teeth in ceramic offerings, pretending that a full stomach is always a blessing. I do not know how long it took, but when awareness returned, it was morning again, and I sat at a desk in the clerk's office with a brush in my hand. The ledger opened before me, my strokes neat and steady, my posture correct, my mind strangely quiet. And when the chief clerk passed behind me, his eyes met mine for a brief heartbeat, and I saw in them a sorrow so deep it felt familiar, as if I had once understood it. On the page, I wrote household names in careful lines, adding marks beside them: fortunate, healthy, young bride. Many children my brush moving smoothly, as if guided by habit older than my own life. And when I reached the bottom of the list, a new name waited there, written in faint ink like a whisper, a traveler arriving from the border road, hungry, tired, searching for work. I dipped my brush and began to write the red number beside it, 34, and as I did, I smiled faintly without knowing why. Because from somewhere beneath the compound, the wet, rhythmic chewing resumed steady, satisfied, and the smell of honeyed rot drifted in like incense. And in the polished bronze mirror at the far end of the room, my reflection looked up from the ledger and smiled wider than it should have, as if it had remembered my name even when I no longer could. And have you ever passed through a small border town where the lanterns hang too evenly, where the tea tastes faintly sweet, where people smile like they've practiced in front of a mirror? Listen carefully to the quiet between sounds, because sometimes, beneath the scratch of brushes and the polite murmur of law, you can still hear a court convening in the dark, counting its mouths, and chewing slowly on whatever fortune wandered in, hungry enough to accept kindness. The body swap. The alley didn't look haunted at first, just neglected in the way old cities neglect the places they don't want to remember, an artery of stone squeezed tight between leaning buildings, where damp never fully dried and sunlight arrived only as a thin, guilty stripe that slid across the ground at noon and vanished before anyone could feel warmed by it. Even in daylight, the walls sweated, their bricks dark with moisture, their mortar mossy and soft like old bread, and the cobblestones underfoot held the scent of sour rain and rotting leaves, of spilled rice wine and yesterday's fish. But at night, when the lanterns along the main street burned like polite lies, this alley became something else entirely, a narrow throat where the city swallowed sound, where footsteps turned, muffled and close, where your own breath seemed too loud and too personal. and if you stood still long enough, you could hear water moving in unseen drains, like something whispering behind clenched teeth. It was in this alley that the beggar slept, curled in a corner behind a leaning stack of broken crates, his body wrapped in a threadbare coat that smelled of soot and old sweat, and the faint metallic tang of coins that never stayed in his palm long enough to matter. The alley knew him the way a dog knows the shape of a man's footsteps, because he returned to it every night as if pulled by invisible string. Not for comfort there was none, but because shame likes familiar shadows. And poverty, after enough years, begins to feel less like circumstance, and more like a skin you can't peel off. His name was Kai, though in the market they called him Hey You, or Getaway, or sometimes nothing at all. Just a flick of the wrist, as if shooing a fly, and he had learned to answer to silence with lowered eyes, to swallow insults as if they were part of the daily ration. Yet inside him, behind the cracked lips and the bowed shoulders, there lived a hunger that wasn't for food, not truly. Kai could go days with only thin porridge and stolen scraps. His hunger was sharper, more humiliating, the hunger of watching other people be treated like humans. The hunger of seeing silk sleeves move through crowds without being shoved aside. The hunger of hearing gold coins clink into bowls that belonged to men who had never begged once in their lives. He had seen hands that never shook from cold, hands jeweled and clean, hands that signed papers and made other people's bodies move, and in the pit of his chest, a sickness grew, a longing so obsessive it felt like devotion. If I could just have that, those hands, those eyes, that body, then the world would kneel differently. Then doors would open like they were born to open for me. Then even the air would taste less bitter. On the night it began, rain fell on a thin, cold sheet that turned the alley into a wet ribbon, and Kai lay awake listening to the city's distant laughter, the muffled clatter of a carriage passing the main street, the music from a tea house where men drank warm wine and spoke about futures, as if futures were something you could purchase. His stomach cramped, not from emptiness, but from envy that made hunger feel like humiliation. And when he shifted to ease the ache, his shoulder brushed a small object wedged in the corner stones. A mirror, no larger than his palm, its surface dull with grime. He might have ignored it, but the alley's darkness bent around it in a way that made it look like an eye half open, watching. Kai picked it up, wiped it on his sleeve, and as the wet grime smeared away, he saw his own face in the dim reflection, thin cheeks, bruised shadows under the eyes, a mouth that looked permanently apologetic, and the sight lit a quiet rage in him so hot it made him tremble. No, he whispered to his own reflection, as if the mirror could argue, not like this. And in that whisper, something in the alley seemed to listen. The water in the drains, pausing for a heartbeat, the damp air tightening as though it had leaned closer. Chai stared at his face until it blurred, and then, as if the city itself had decided to torment him, the mirror's surface shimmered faintly, and for a breath-long moment the reflection changed, not into a ghost or a demon, nothing so simple, but into a version of himself, with eyes that held confidence, with skin that looked warm and clean, with a jawline that suggested he belonged to rooms where decisions were made. The image vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only his real face again. But Kai's heart had already latched onto it, his hunger sharpening into certainty. Something in this alley knew what he wanted. The next day he carried the mirror like a secret, wrapped in cloth, and as he wandered the city's older quarter where temples sat between shops like tired elders, he found himself drawn toward a shrine he had never entered before, hidden beyond a narrow side street, its entrance half blocked by a crumbling archway carved with worn characters that no longer looked like blessings so much as warnings. The shrine smelled wrong even from outside, not just incense but damp stone, and old offerings left too long, and above the door hung a faded red knot whose threads had darkened to the color of dried blood. People avoided it, stepping past without looking, and Kai noticed that even the boldest vendors lowered their voices as they passed, as though afraid the shrine might overhear desire. He slipped inside anyway, because desperation makes fear feel optional. The interior was dim and close, lit by a few trembling candles, and the air carried a sweet, spoiled smell that reminded him of bruised fruit, so faint he might have imagined it, while a low wooden altar sat at the far end, not dedicated to any clean-faced deity, but to a figure whose features had been chipped away until only the outline remained. A body, without a face, draped in sculpted robes, its hands extended as though offering or requesting, hard to tell which. Kai's bare feet made no sound on the worn stone floor, and the silence pressed against him like cloth over a mouth. He approached the altar and saw offerings arranged not in the usual neat bowls of fruit and rice, but in mismatched objects that made his skin prickle. An old ring, a broken comb, a silk button, a small piece of gold leaf folded like a tongue. And behind these objects, half hidden in shadow, was a stack of mirrors, small mirrors, cracked mirrors, polished bronze mirrors, leaning together like faces pressed close in gossip. Kai's pulse thudded so loud he feared the statue would hear it and punish him for being alive. Yet his hunger pushed him forward, and with shaking hands he placed his own mirror on the altar, then fumbled in his pocket for the only thing he truly owned, a coin, bent and tarnished. He set it beside the mirror and waited, feeling absurd, because what did beggars know of rituals, besides the daily ritual of begging? But then softly he heard something behind him, a whisper of cloth, a breath of movement, and when he turned, there was no one, only the mirrors leaning in the shadows, their surfaces catching candlelight in thin slivers like eyes. The air grew colder in his nostrils, and his stomach tightened with a sudden hollow sensation, as if his body had realized it was standing at the edge of something hungry. Kai turned back to the altar and found the statue's blank face seemed darker than before, as though it had opened a mouth and the stone was inhaling. He should have left, should have run, but instead, he did the one thing he'd been doing his whole life. He bargained with emptiness. "I want to be rich," he whispered, voice cracking. "I want to be respected. I want to be..." The words tangled, shame burning his throat, but then anger steadied him. "I want the body of someone the world will not spit on." And as he spoke, the candles flickered violently, flames bending toward him as if tasting his breath. The mirrors in the shadow seemed to brighten, reflections rippling, and Kai felt, with sudden certainty, that he was not alone. Something unseen had stepped close enough that the air warmed around his skin like a hand hovering near. He didn't see a demon, didn't hear a booming voice, only a faint sound, like wet fingers sliding across glass, and then without warning a sharp, needle-like pain stabbed behind his eyes. Kai gasped and clutched his face, and the room spun, the candlelight smearing into long streaks. The pain moved downward, creeping into his wrists, into his palms, into his fingers as if invisible insects were burrowing beneath his skin. He dropped to his knees, biting back a scream, and the statue loomed above him in the dim like an indifferent judge. In the mirrors, he caught glimpses of movement, hands, eyes, lips floating in reflections that were not his, as if other lives were leaning out of the glass toward him. Kai's vision dimmed, and in that dimness, he heard it clearly for the first time, not chewing like in Heshwi, but a slow, careful sound like a seamstress pulling thread through flesh. Ch, 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 a sound of joining, of stitching. He passed out on the shrine floor with his cheek pressed against cold stone, smelling incense and spoiled sweetness. And when he woke, the city was quiet, the candles extinguished, the altar bare except for his mirror and the bent coin, and his body felt heavier, fuller, as if someone had packed him with warm cotton. He staggered up, dizzy, and the first thing he noticed was his vision, sharper, brighter, as if the world had been polished. The cracks in the temple stone stood out with cruel clarity. The dust motes in the air glittered like tiny insects, and when he glanced at his hands, he froze. His hands were not his hands. The fingers were longer, the nails cleaner, the skin paler and smoother, the knuckles shaped differently, as if carved by a life that had never scrabbled in dirt. A thrill of disbelief surged up his spine so fast it nearly made him laugh. And when he stumbled out of the shrine into the alley, the damp air hitting his face like cold water, he felt his eyes widen because he could see, truly see the world with a strange authority, like someone had lifted him onto a higher step of reality. He ran, barefoot, heart hammering, to his usual alley corner where a puddle collected in a broken stone basin, and he leaned over it, panting, expecting, praying to see a noble face looking back. For one breath, the reflection was blurred by ripples, but then it steadied, and Kai stared at his own eyes that were no longer dull and desperate but dark and luminous, framed by thicker lashes, eyes that looked like they'd been born to gaze at servants and have servants gaze back. His mouth fell open, and that mouth was not fully his either. The lips slightly fuller, the teeth straighter, the jaw subtly stronger. It worked, he whispered, voice trembling with worshipful disbelief. And he laughed, a raw sound that turned into a cough because his throat felt tight, as if the laughter didn't quite fit the body he was wearing. He pushed himself upright and flexed his fingers, watching how gracefully the joints moved, how naturally the hands seemed to want to hold a brush, a goblet, a jewel, and his mind raced. Silk, carriage, warm meals, clean bedding, doors opening, people bowing. But then he noticed something that made the thrill hesitate. The smell. The alley still smelled of damp and refuse, but beneath it, clinging to his own skin now, was a faint scent like expensive oil sandalwood, perhaps overlaid with something sour, something wrong. He lifted one of his new hands to his nose and inhaled, and his stomach lurched at the faint spoiled sweetness that rose from his skin like breath from rotting fruit. He swallowed, forcing calm, telling himself it was simply the lingering temple incense, simply the alley's dampness clinging to him. And he staggered back to his makeshift shelter behind the crates, because even with new eyes and hands, he was still wearing ragged clothes, still barefoot, still surrounded by filth, and the dissonance hit him like a slap. He looked like a nobleman's hand stitched onto a beggar's life. Kai rummaged through his belongings for anything reflective metal scraps, the small mirror again, and when he held the mirror up, the candlelight from the street lantern caught his face and revealed a detail that froze his blood. The skin around his eyes was slightly darker, faintly bruised, as if the flesh there had been handled too roughly, and the veins at his temples looked more pronounced. He blinked, and the sensation was strange, like his eyelids moved with a different weight. Then his gaze slid down to his wrists where his sleeves had slipped back, exposing a thin red ring around both wrists. Raw, tender, as if something had been tied there recently and removed. Kai's breath came shallow. "No," he whispered, already bargaining again. "That's nothing. That's..." But as he spoke, his new hands trembled, and the fingertips began to tingle in a way he'd never felt before. Not numbness from cold, but a creeping itch from inside the skin, like the body was trying to reject something it didn't recognize. He pressed his fingers together, and for a moment the skin stuck slightly like damp paper. Panic surged, and he yanked his hands apart, staring, and saw a faint shine at the seam of his knuckle, as though moisture had gathered beneath the surface. Kai's mouth went dry. He looked again into the mirror, and the noble eyes stared back brilliantly. But behind their brilliance, deep in the pupils, he saw something that made his stomach drop. A flicker of darkness, like decay hiding under varnish. His heart hammered as he remembered the shrine's blank-faced statue, the mirrors stacked like hungry witnesses, the sound of stitching, and he realized with sick clarity that he had not been given these parts so much as loaned them, forced onto him like clothing taken from a corpse. As he sat trembling in his filthy shelter, the city's night noises returning distant laughter, carriage wheels, the hum of wealth, Kai held his mirror tighter until his knuckles whitened, and he whispered to his reflection with desperate reverence, "Just let it last." But in the damp air of the alley, the spoiled sweetness thickened around him like a perfume that had turned, and from somewhere nearby, perhaps inside the drains, perhaps inside the walls, came a sound so soft it could have been imagination, a faint, wet creak, like something trying to pull itself free of stitches. By morning the rain had stopped, leaving the old city rinsed and gleaming in places where it had no right to look clean. And Sai woke with a pounding behind his eyes that felt like someone had pressed hot coins against his skull. For a moment, he lay still under his threadbare coat, listening to the alley breathe the steady drip in the drains, the soft scrape of rats and unseen gaps. Then he lifted his head and the world snapped into sharpness with unsettling clarity. Every crack in the wall etched like a map, every fleck of moss vibrant as if painted fresh. And that clarity thrilled him even as it made his stomach churn, because the first thing he smelled was himself. Sandalwood over sourness, expensive oil over damp rot, a nobleman's scent stitched onto a beggar's life. His hands lay on his chest, pale and elegant, even in the grime light. And when he flexed them, they moved like instruments, too graceful for the alley, and the sensation of having them, of owning that kind of body, made something inside him rise with feverish hope, the kind of hope that feels like worship. He sat up and reached for the mirror, holding it close, and the eyes that stared back still looked wrong in the best way, deep, confident, luminous. Yet the bruising around them had darkened overnight into faint purple shadows like exhaustion trapped under the skin. And when he blinked, the lids dragged slightly, as if the flesh beneath was heavier than it ought to be. He tried to laugh again, and heard his voice catch in his throat, thin and unfamiliar, and the sound made him angry. Angry at the alley, angry at the city, angry at poverty for daring to cling to him even now. So he stood and walked out, shoulders higher than before, head lifted, testing what it felt like to move through the world as someone worth noticing. The market street was already awake, vendors shouting, steam rising from food stalls, coins clinking like the music of other people's futures. And as Kai stepped into the crowd, he felt eyes slide over him and then hesitate, returning for a second look, not at his ragged robe or bare feet, but at his face, his gaze, the authority in his posture that didn't belong to him, but now sat on him like a stolen coat. A woman selling buns paused mid-gesture and blinked as if she'd almost bowed. A shop clerk's voice softened when he told Kai to move aside, the insult catching before it fully formed. Kai's heart thudded with a greedy joy so sharp it tasted metallic, because this tiny shift in how the world treated him was everything he had ever wanted, proof that the city did not despise souls, only appearances. He drifted toward the jewelry quarter, as if pulled by invisible thread, because his new hands tingled when he neared it, a restless itch in the fingertips that felt like recognition, like memory waking in muscle. And when he passed a goldsmith's stall, the tingling became a subtle pull, as though his palms wanted to reach out and cradle the gleaming metal with reverence. He paused, and without thinking, his fingers moved index and thumb, pinching the air with precise delicacy. The exact motion of someone trained to hold fine chain without breaking it, and the goldsmith, an old man with magnifying lenses strapped to his head, looked up sharply at the movement as if he'd seen a fellow craftsman in the posture. "You," the goldsmith said, suspicion mixing with curiosity. "Where did you learn that?" Chai stared at his own hand, startled by its confidence, and heat rose in his cheeks as he realized the hand had answered before his mind did. I can work," he said quickly, lying in the only way poverty teaches, fast, shameless, desperate. The goldsmith's gaze traveled over Kai's face, lingered on the eyes, softened a fraction. Then he grunted. "Come back when you've washed," he said, "and when you have shoes." But it wasn't a dismissal. It was an invitation disguised as advice. Kai stumbled away, breathless, nearly laughing, and for a moment the alley's filth felt distant, like a nightmare he'd outgrown overnight. He found a public wash basin by a temple courtyard and scrubbed his face and hands until his skin stung, and as the grime lifted, the noble oil scent bloomed more clearly, sandalwood and something floral, but beneath it, the sourness remained stubbornly present, like a stain the skin refused to release. He watched the water turn gray with his old life, and when he looked up at his reflection in the basin, his new eyes stared back, bright and hungry, too hungry, maybe, and for a breath-long instant, the reflection shifted again. Not a beggar, not even Kai, but a stern older face with a scar at the brow, eyes colder, expression proud, as if someone else were looking out through Kai's borrowed gaze. Kai jerked back with a gasp, water rippling, reflection breaking apart, and his heart raced as he told himself it was only sunlight, only exhaustion, only the mind adjusting to change. But when he blinked hard, the bruising under his eyes seemed darker still, and his eyelids felt swollen, as if the new eyes were heavy with a grief Kai did not understand. He rushed away from the basin and returned to the jewelry quarter, hiding his unease behind ambition. Because ambition is the kind of blindness that feels like strength. The goldsmith's stall was busy, but when Kai approached, the old man looked up immediately, gaze sharpening with that same odd recognition, and without further questions he waved Kai inside a small back room where tools lay arranged like surgical instruments. "Show me," he said bluntly, placing a broken clasp on the table, and Kai's stomach fluttered with fear because he had never done such work in his life. Yet when he reached for the clasp, his hands moved with terrifying certainty, fingers steady, wrists fluid, nails catching light as they manipulated the tiny metal loop as if they had done it 1,000 times. The goldsmith watched, eyebrows lifting, and in that silent watching, Kai felt a strange sensation in his palms. Pleasure, not pride, but something physical, like the hands themselves were relieved to be doing what they were meant to do. Within minutes, the clasp lay repaired, neat as new, and the goldsmith exhaled through his nose, impressed despite himself. "Strange," he muttered. "Very strange. Your hands are trained." Kai swallowed hard. "I can learn more," he said quickly. "I need work." The goldsmith studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Come tomorrow," he said. "Early. I'll pay you for piecework." Kai's chest flooded with triumph so intense it almost hurt, and as he left the stall he imagined silver in his pouch, imagined better food, imagined a room with a door that locked from the inside, imagined silk sleeves replacing rags. But as he hurried through the streets, the tingling in his hands returned, sharper now, turning into an itch deep beneath the skin, and when he looked down, he saw the first sign of true horror. Faint, dark lines branching at the base of his fingernails like bruised roots, subtle enough to miss, unless you were watching for decay. His breath caught, and he shoved his hands into his sleeves, walking faster, telling himself it was only cold, only dirt trapped under nail beds, only his imagination punishing him for daring to rise. Yet the sour scent followed him like a shadow, thickening as the day warmed, and by afternoon he began to notice people reacting not with admiration, but with discomfort. Subtle flinches, brief widening of eyes before politeness returned. A young woman selling ribbons smiled at him, then faltered as her nose wrinkled slightly, as if she'd caught a whiff of spoiled sweetness. A child staring at his bright eyes began to cry without warning and hid behind his mother's skirt, pointing at Kai's face as if seeing something adults refused to see. Kai's pride curdled into panic, and he ducked back into his alley, heart racing, because the alley at least did not judge an alley, simply swallowed what you dropped into it. He sat in his corner behind the crates, breathing hard, and pulled out the mirror with shaken hands, and what he saw made his stomach lurch. The bruising beneath his eyes had spread outward in faint mottled patterns, like fruit turning, and the whites of his eyes, those noble eyes, were threaded with delicate red veins that seemed too numerous, too eager, like roots searching for soil. He leaned closer, desperate for reassurance, and his reflection leaned too, but the expression on the reflection's face wasn't his. The mouth was set in a faint sneer, the kind of sneer Kai had seen on lords who looked at beggars as if they were stains. And when Kai tried to relax his lips, the sneer remained for a half-beat longer before shifting into his own expression, as though the face in the mirror needed time to remember whose life it was wearing. Terror prickled along Kai's scalp, and his hands trembled harder, the itch now becoming a crawling sensation beneath the skin, and he realized with cold certainty that these parts were not passive gifts. They had memory, identity, a history that resisted being owned by someone like him. He pressed the mirror closer, whispering, "No, no. I asked for this. I paid." And the word paid tasted bitter, because what had he paid besides desperation? Besides a bent coin and a mirror and a wish? The smell in the alley thickened, spoiled sweetness blooming as if his skin were fermenting, and Kai's gaze dropped to his wrists, where the red rings had faded into darker bruises, and on the inside of his left wrist, just beneath the bruise, he saw faint characters appearing in the skin, like ink rising through paper, tiny strokes forming a word that made his blood go cold, because it was not a blessing, not a name, but a ledger mark. Return. Kai's breath hitched, and as he stared, the letters seemed to deepen in color, as if written from inside his veins, and the crawling sensation under his hands sharpened into pain, a hot sting spreading along his fingers like a warning. He staggered up, mirror clutched to his chest, and stumbled back toward the hidden shrine, because suddenly he didn't want wealth anymore. He wanted an explanation. He wanted the stitching undone before rot completed its claim. The shrine was dim as before, smelling of damp stone and spoiled incense, and the blank-faced statue waited like it had never moved. But when Kai approached the altar, the mirrors in the shadows seemed to shift slightly, catching candlelight in new angles as though turning their faces toward him. Kai slammed his mirror onto the altar, voice cracking. "Take it back," he whispered fiercely. "Take him back. Give me." He stopped, because the truth stabbed him. Give me what? His old eyes that could not meet anyone's gaze? His old hands cracked and bleeding from cold? The poverty skin that the world spat on? His mouth trembled, and in that tremble his fear became rage. "I want it to fit," he hissed. "I want the body to match. I want to be someone who deserves this." The candles flickered, the mirrors brightened, the air tightened, and from behind the altar came that subtle sound again. Ch, ch, stitching, pulling thread through flesh. Che's hands seized with sudden pain, fingers curling inward as if cramping, and he watched in horror as the dark lines under his nails spread, creeping like ink into skin, and the smell of spoiled sweetness swelled around him so thick it felt like breath in his mouth. He stumbled back, gasping, and in the nearest mirror he saw not his own face but the stern older face, again, clearer now, eyes cold with contempt, lips moving without sound, as if forming words Kai could not hear. And the expression in those borrowed eyes was not fear, it was disgust, as though the parts themselves were rejecting the poverty soul they had been stitched onto. And Kai realized the shrine had granted his wish in the cruelest way possible. It had given him noble parts, but it had not given him a noble soul, and now the mismatch was rotting from the inside out like meat left in silk. And as the stitching sound grew louder in the shadows, Kai fell to his knees before the blank-faced statue and understood too late that some hungers are not for food or wealth at all. Some hungers are for belonging, and if you try to steal belonging with borrowed flesh, the borrowed flesh will remember who it truly belongs to, and it will begin, slowly and patiently, to crawl back home. Kai left the shrine with his hands wrapped in his sleeves like a man hiding stolen blades. The damp air outside, cold against his face, yet useless against the heat crawling beneath his skin, and as he hurried through the alleyways, the spoiled sweetness seemed to follow him in a thin, invisible ribbon, clinging to his breath, blooming from his pores, turning every inhale into something faintly fermented. The city around him continued as if nothing had happened. Vendors shouting, carts rattling, temple bells chiming in polite distance. Yet Kai moved through it like a man carrying a secret corpse under his ribs, because the pain in his fingers had become a constant sting, the kind that makes you want to bite down on cloth just to keep from making noise. And when he glanced down at his knuckles, he saw the skin there had begun to shine in patches, damp in a way sweat shouldn't be, as though moisture was collecting under the surface. And in the thin midday light, the flesh looked slightly translucent, revealing faint branching veins like bruised roots searching for escape. He returned to his alley corner behind the crates, breathing hard, and tried to convince himself he could endure it, that this was merely the price of transformation, a temporary sickness before the world finally accepted him as its own, because hope is stubborn even when it starts to rot. But when he lifted the mirror again, the noble eyes staring back at him looked irritated rather than afraid, and that irritation cut deeper than terror, because it felt like judgment. Like the eyes themselves were offended by the filth surrounding them, by the begging posture of the shoulders, by the smell of poverty, and when Kai whispered, "It's my body now," the reflection's mouth shaped a faint smile that wasn't his. a small, cruel curve, as if amused by the lie. His stomach churned, yet hunger, the old humiliating hunger, still lived in him, and it didn't care about pain. It cared about opportunity. So the next morning he went to the goldsmith anyway, because poverty teaches you to keep walking, even when your insides beg you to lie down and disappear. The jewelry quarter glinted as always, gold catching sunlight like trapped fire, and as Kai approached the stall, the itch in his hand sharpened into a pulsing ache that felt like eager recognition, his borrowed fingers twitching, as if smelling metal from a distance. And the goldsmith's eyes lifted immediately, narrowing in cautious respect as though those hands carried their own resume. "Early," the old man grunted, sliding a tray of broken clasps and bent chains toward him. And Kai sat, shoulders tense, breathing through his mouth to avoid catching the sour sweetness rising from his own skin, then began to work, and for the first hour the miracle held. His fingers moved with elegant certainty, bending wire, tightening links, polishing edges, every motion so precise it felt like the hands were thinking for him, and the goldsmith's gruff approval came in low, noises of satisfaction that made Kai's chest swell with a bitter joy. This is it. This is how it starts. But then the heat under his nails flared, pain shooting up his wrists like fire licking thread, and he almost dropped a delicate chain into the dust. He clenched his jaw and continued, because quitting is a luxury. But as the morning wore on, the sweetness thickened around him, and he noticed customers beginning to hesitate near the stall, their polite smiles faltering, noses wrinkling subtly, as if something spoiled had been left in the sun. One woman leaned in to inspect a necklace, then recoiled a fraction, eyes flicking to Kai's hands with a faint disgust. She quickly masked behind etiquette, and in that glance, Kai saw the truth. No matter how noble his eyes looked, the body was betraying him in a language everyone understood: smell, sheen, the wrong dampness of skin. He tried to ignore it, tried to bury himself in work, but then something worse happened. The jewelry began to react to him. As he held a gold ring between his thumb and forefinger, the metal warmed strangely fast, not from his skin alone, but as if responding to a deeper heat, and the ring's shine dulled in the exact spot his fingertips touched, turning faintly cloudy like breath fogging a mirror. Shai froze, heart thudding, because he had seen this before, in poor markets, when cheap metal tarnishes under sweat. Except this was real gold, and the dullness spread outward in a slow halo as if the gold itself had begun to sicken. He pulled his fingers away, and the ring gleamed again, but not fully, like something had licked it, leaving residue. The goldsmith noticed too, his eyes narrowing. "What did you do?" he snapped, snatching the ring, rubbing it hard on his sleeve. The dullness remained as a faint stain, and Kai's mouth went dry, because he couldn't answer without revealing that something inside him was decomposing. "My hands are cold," Kai lied, voice strained. Maybe the oil," but the goldsmith's gaze sharpened with suspicion, and for the first time Kai saw fear there too, the fear of craftspeople who understand materials and know when something impossible is happening. "Wash your hands," the old man ordered, gesturing sharply toward a basin. Kai obeyed, scrubbing until his knuckles burned, and as the grime lifted, the skin beneath looked wrong, too pale, too waxy, like fruit flesh left exposed, and around the cuticles the dark lines had thickened into bruised crescents. He returned to the bench, trying to keep his sleeves low, but the itch had become unbearable now, crawling deeper, as though tiny mouths were chewing from inside his fingers, and when he picked up a thin silver chain, his hand twitched involuntarily, the chain slipping, and it fell across the bench with a soft metallic hiss. The goldsmith's patience snapped like thread. "Enough," he growled. "Your hands, they're wrong." Kai's face burned. "I can work," he insisted desperately, pushing forward another repaired clasp as proof, but the goldsmith leaned closer, sniffing the air with slow disgust. "You smell like a rotten orchard," he muttered, and the words struck Kai like a slap because they were true, and he could no longer pretend otherwise. Humiliation flared into rage, and Kai stood too quickly, the room spinning, his borrowed eyes flashing with an arrogance that didn't belong to him but now lived behind his pupils. And in that instant, the goldsmith flinched, not from Kai's poor clothes, but from that gaze, that noble contempt suddenly surfacing like a face breaking through water. "Get out," the goldsmith hissed, voice low, "before you spoil my metal and my luck." The mention of luck made Kai's stomach drop, because it wasn't just his body that was rotting, it was infecting the world around him. He stumbled out into the street, heart hammering, and the city seemed to lean away from him now, strangers unconsciously shifting aside as he passed, eyes narrowing, hands tightening on purses, not because he looked like a beggar, but because something about him felt contaminated. By afternoon, the pain in his fingers became sharp enough to make him gasp in public, and when he ducked into a narrow lane to hide, he pulled his sleeves back and saw horror blooming openly. The skin on the back of his right hand had begun to blister, tiny bubbles forming under the surface like boiled fat, and one blister had already split, weeping a clear, sticky fluid that smelled faintly sweet, like sugar fermenting. He gagged, pressing his lips together, then wiped the fluid on his ragged robe, and where it smeared the cloth darkened, as if dampened by oil, leaving a stain the color of bruised fruit. Panic took him in waves, hot, cold, hot because he suddenly understood what return on his wrist meant. The parts were not only rejecting him, they were preparing to detach. He ran back to the shrine as if running could outrun rot, shoving through the archway, collapsing before the altar with shaking hands, and whispered through clenched teeth, "Stop it, make it fit, make me match." But the shrine answered, not with voice, only with that slow stitching sound, ch, ch, now joined by something wetter, a faint peeling noise, like skin separating from bone. The mirrors in the shadows brightened, catching candlelight like hungry pupils, and in one reflection Kai saw the stern older face again, clearer than ever. But now the face wasn't merely watching, it was smiling. A thin, satisfied smile, as if the owner of the parts had been waiting patiently for the rot to do its work. Kai's throat tightened with sudden understanding. These parts weren't random gifts. They belonged to someone wealthy enough to have pieces worth stealing, someone whose life had been cut into valuables like a body turned into treasure. And Kai was not becoming noble, he was becoming a temporary storage vessel, a dirty sack for luxury organs until the rightful owner reclaimed them. "Who are you?" Kai whispered to the mirror, voice cracking, and in the reflection the stern face's lips moved, forming silent words that Kai felt rather than heard, a cold sentence pressing directly into his mind like ink into paper. "Not yours." Kai recoiled, clutching his head, and as he did, pain exploded behind his eyes, so sharp it made his vision flash white. He screamed, a small, strangled sound, and fell sideways, because his new eyes were burning, as if rubbed with salt, and when he clawed at his face, his fingertips came away slick. He scrambled toward a candle and held the mirror close, trembling, and what he saw nearly broke his sanity. The whites of his eyes had yellowed slightly at the edges, veins spidering darker, and around the iris, the skin looked swollen, as if the socket itself was inflamed, while the bruising beneath had deepened into mottled patches like rot creeping under fruit skin. He blinked hard and felt a wet drag, and the mirror showed the eyelids sticking for a heartbeat before releasing, leaving a thin, glistening strand of fluid like sap. Kai sobbed without meaning to, the sound raw and animal, because this was no longer body swap as blessing. It was decay as punishment, a lesson carved into flesh. You cannot graft luxury onto desperation and expect it to bloom. As he knelt shaking, the statue's faceless head seemed to lean closer in the candle tremor, and Kai suddenly remembered the offering objects on the altar, the ring, the comb, with a silk button, gold leaf folded like a tongue, each one a piece of someone else's life laid down like meat. And he realized the shrine wasn't granting wishes, it was running a market. Poor souls traded pain for pieces of rich souls, and the only law was compatibility. The only truth was that poverty itself was considered a kind of spiritual filth. Kai's breath hitched as a new sensation crept along his forearm, coldness spreading outward from his wrist like ink in water, and when he looked down, he saw the bruised rings around his wrists darken, the skin there tightening, sinking slightly, as if shrinking away from the bone, and beneath the return mark, new characters began to appear, writing themselves slowly through his veins. Unfit. The word landed in him like a verdict, and with it came a deep humiliation, so intense it turned to rage. Rage at the shrine. Rage at the city. Rage at every polished hand that had ever pushed him aside, and he slammed his fist against the altar, only to yelp because the skin split, oozing sweet fluid that hissed faintly when it touched the stone like sugar on hot iron. The mirrors flickered as if delighted, and the stitching sound rose louder, frantic now, as though invisible hands were preparing to unthread him, and Kai realized with sudden frantic clarity that the final stage wouldn't be death, not the simple mercy of collapse, but separation, his body becoming a workshop where organs were repossessed one by one. He staggered out of the shrine into the late afternoon light, clutching his mirror, and the city looked different now. Not beautiful, not indifferent, but predatory, full of eyes that measured worth, full of hands that held things they didn't deserve. And he stumbled back toward the alley because even if the parts left him, even if his noble eyes fell out like spoiled fruit, the alley was the only place that wouldn't stare. Yet as he limped, the smell of spoiled sweetness grew so strong it turned heads openly. Strangers stepping away with disgust, and in the glass of shop windows he caught his reflection, flashing past noble eyes in a face already beginning to look waxy and wrong. Hands too pale with blistered skin, a wealthy man's parts rotting inside a beggar's life, and the last thing he heard before night fell was not laughter, not carriage wheels, but a faint wet peeling sound from inside his own wrists, like thread being pulled loose, like something valuable preparing to crawl out of him and return to where it belonged. Night fell like damp cloth pressed over the city's mouth, and Kai stumbled through streets that now seemed narrower and more hostile, every lantern light turning the wet cobbles into a slick, glistening path that reflected his moving shadow like a second body trying to keep up, and the smell trailing him sandalwood, drowned in spoiled sweetness, had grown so strong it felt less like odor and more like announcement, as though his rotting, borrowed parts were ringing a bell only hunger could hear. He kept one hand clamped over his left wrist, because the coldness there had intensified into a deep, numb ache, and beneath his fingers he could feel the skin tightening like a knot being pulled closed. The bruised ring dark and swollen as if a cord had been cinched under the flesh, while his right hand, the jeweler's hand, throbbed with crawling heat, blisters blooming along the knuckles like pearls of sickness, splitting and weeping clear, sticky fluid that dried too fast into a sweet crust. Every so often his vision shimmered, the noble eyes watering with viscous tears that clung to his lashes, and when he blinked he felt the lids stick and peel, as if the eyes themselves were trying to detach from his face in disgust. He reached his alley and collapsed behind the crates, panting, mirror clutched in both hands like a charm, and for a moment he tried to bargain with exhaustion. Maybe he could hide here until the rod stopped. Maybe the parts would calm if he stayed still. Maybe the shrine had simply punished his impatience. But the alley answered him with a low, wet sound from the drain, a slow bubbling like laughter in dirty water. And when Kai looked down, he saw the drain grating shimmer faintly, as though something beneath it had opened an eye. Panic flared so hot it cleared his fatigue in an instant, because he realized he wasn't being rejected by the world alone. He was being called from below, summoned the way debts are summoned when they come due. He tried to stand, but his left wrist seized with sudden stabbing pain, and he saw, with horror, the skin there had begun to sink inward in a thin groove all the way around, as if invisible thread were cutting into him from every side, and under the mark, return, the word unfit, deepened into dark purple like bruised ink, then began to spread outward in fine branching lines that resembled script, as if the shrine was writing a contract across his body. Kai bit back a scream and staggered toward the hidden shrine on pure animal instinct, pushing through back lanes slick with rain, because he could no longer endure uncertainty. The only thing worse than pain is not knowing how much worse it will become. The crumbling archway of the shrine waited in shadow like a mouth missing teeth, and when Kai crossed the threshold, the air inside turned thick and warm, sweet in that nauseating fermented way, as if the room had been filled with fruit left to spoil for offerings, and the mirrors along the wall seemed brighter than before. their surfaces trembling with candlelight, even though no wind moved. Chai fell to his knees before the altar, shaking so hard his teeth clicked, and slammed the mirror down. "Stop," he rasped, voice cracked and thin. "Stop it, please, just stop." He hated the pleading, hated the weakness, but desperation scraped him raw. "I did what you wanted. I paid. The candles flared violently, flames bending toward him as if tasting the words, and from the dark behind the statue came the stitching sound again. Faster now, impatient, joined by a wet tugging noise like cloth being pulled from a wound. Kai's stomach lurched as the skin around his wrist tightened, and suddenly his fingers went completely numb, as if the nerves were being pinched off one by one. And when he looked down, he saw his left hand twitching on its own, fingers flexing in small, precise motions that were not his testing joints, checking strength as though the hand were preparing itself for travel. He tried to force it still, but the hand resisted him with a frightening calm, and in the nearest mirror, the stern older face appeared again, no longer flickering but steady and clear, eyes fixed on Kai with cold ownership. And when Kai mouthed, "Who are you?" the reflection's lips moved in slow, silent contempt, forming words that Sai felt like a knife pressed into his mind. "You were never the buyer. You were the storage." Kai sobbed, part fear, part humiliation, and a new sound rose from the floor beneath the altar, faint but unmistakable. A soft tapping, like fingernails against stone from below, as though something beneath the shrine had begun to knock politely, requesting what belonged to it. The statue's blank face seemed darker than the shadows around it, and the air tightened, then shifted, as if the room had inhaled. Kai clutched the altar edge, trying not to collapse into panic, and pleaded through clenched teeth. "Make me match, make me worthy, take my soul if you want, just make it fit." And as those words left his mouth, the mirrors along the wall brightened at once, reflecting not Kai but a procession of faces, wealthy faces, pale faces, faces with jeweled ears and smug mouths, some laughing silently, some crying, some staring with dead indifference. And Kai realized the shrine was not a single entity but a marketplace of hungers, an auction of identity where parts were traded like coins. The tapping from below became louder, and the stitching sound sharpened into a cutting sound. And Kai felt the first true unthreading, a cold slide behind his left wrist, as if a thin blade had been drawn under skin, and the groove around his wrist deepened suddenly, spilling a bead of clear, sweet fluid that rolled down like syrup. He screamed, then could not hold it back. Yet the scream came out wrong, a hoarse gurgle because his throat felt tight, as though even his voice was being repossessed. His vision blurred with thick tears, and in the mirrors he saw the stern older face lift a hand, his hand and flex it with satisfaction. And for a moment Kai felt what that hand remembered. Rings on fingers, silk cuffs, warm rooms, servants' bowed heads, the weight of gold as normal as breath. The memory hit Kai like a drug and made him sob harder because he understood the final cruelty. The parts didn't just bring privilege, they brought the taste of privilege. And once you tasted it, you could never return to your old emptiness without madness. He tried to pull his hand away from the tightening groove, but the numbness made him clumsy, and the hand itself began to separate, skin at the wrist turning pale and waxy, the groove widening as if invisible fingers were gently twisting him apart. The tapping from below turned into scratching, and the stone floor under the altar trembled faintly, as though something heavy was shifting in sleep. Kai looked up at the statue and saw, in a moment of candle flicker, that the blank face wasn't blank at all. There was a faint indentation where a mouth should be, a long, thin slit like a seam, and the seam began to open slowly, impossibly, revealing darkness that looked wet and deep, and from within that darkness came a breath carrying the richest spoiled sweetness yet. Like a cellar filled with fermenting fruit and old blood, the mouth spoke without words, but Kai heard it inside his skull, a calm, transactional certainty. Mismatch. Return approved. His left hand jerked violently, and with a wet tearing sensation that made Kai retch, the final threads holding it tightened. The hand didn't fly off like a severed limb. There was no dramatic spray of blood, because the shrine was efficient, surgical, cruelly clean. Instead, the flesh at the groove liquefied into that clear, sweet fluid, dissolving as if the body itself was admitting defeat, and the hand slid free with a soft sucking sound, fingers curling once as though greeting an old owner, then impossibly crawled across the altar on its own, leaving a glistening trail, moving with calm purpose toward the row of mirrors. Kai screamed until his throat burned, grabbing for the crawling hand with his remaining one. But the moment his right hand touched it, his right hand's blisters split and sizzled, and a sudden wave of cold shot up his arm like the nerve itself had been bitten, forcing him to recoil. The severed hand reached the mirrors and pressed its palm against a cracked bronze surface, and the mirror rippled like water, swallowing the hand slowly, politely, as if accepting a returned item into inventory. Kai sat shaking, staring at the stump that wasn't a stump so much as a smooth, wet end, sealed by sweetness and rot, and his mind tried to fracture to escape the horror, but the shrine wouldn't allow him even that mercy, because the tapping from below resumed, firmer now, and the numb ache spread into his forearm as if the next part in the chain had been scheduled. The stern older face in the mirror smiled faintly gratified, and for the first time Kai noticed details. The face wore a signet ring on the other hand, the hand Kai still had, and on the ring was a crest shaped like a palace gate. The reflection mouthed another silent phrase, slow and deliberate, and Kai felt it like cold ink in his brain. Eyes next. He clawed at his face with his remaining hand, sobbing, begging, swearing, trying to close his eyes forever so they couldn't be taken. But the noble eyes throbbed with burning dryness, lids sticking, tears thickening into glue, and the bruise around the sockets spread in petal-like rot. The shrine's seam mouth widened slightly, inhaling, and the air filled with the scent of wealth turned rancid, privilege spoiled, and Kai understood, with collapsing clarity, to that this was the true ritual. Beggars came here to borrow the appearance of riches, and the shrine always collected it back with interest, leaving them not merely poor again but mutilated, hollowed, punished for daring to want more than the world had assigned them. The floor beneath the altar groaned, stone grinding like teeth, and Kai felt a sudden tug behind his eyes, as if invisible hooks had latched onto the sockets, pulling gently at first, testing, and he shrieked as his vision flashed with white pain, because the eyes were loosening, the world turning watery, the mirrors along the wall brightening with eager reflections as if ready to receive their property, and in the last clear second before darkness swallowed detail, Kai saw the stern older face in the mirror lean close, eyes glittering with ownership, and he realized the final insult. The owner wasn't dead, wasn't a ghost. He was alive somewhere, wealthy somewhere, and he had been using shrines like this to refresh himself, to discard old parts into desperate bodies like Kai's, letting poverty carry the decay for him until the parts were cleaned by suffering and returned renewed by fear. And Kai's last coherent thought before the pain ripped his sight sideways was not even hatred. It was the unbearable realization that in this city, even rot could be outsourced downward. Kai did not faint, not fully, because the shrine would not grant him that mercy. Instead, his awareness stretched thin and trembled like oil on water as the invisible hooks behind his eyes tightened with patient delicacy, and he felt his vision distort in slow waves, the altar bending, the candles elongating into smeared gold lines until the world became a wet blur pulsing with pain, and in that blur he saw his own reflection multiply across the mirrors, like a curse repeating itself, each reflection wearing those borrowed noble eyes with a different expression. Contempt, pity, hunger, laughter. His hands, his single remaining hand scrabbled uselessly at the stone floor, nails cracking. But his body was no longer fully his, because the shrine had already declared him unfit. And something declared unfit becomes an object, and objects are easy to take apart. He tried to beg again, voice ragged, but the sound came out like air through damp cloth, a thin gurgle, and the seam mouth of the faceless statue opened wider, as though amused by the desperation, inhaling the spoiled sweetness that now seemed to pour out of Kai's skin in thick, invisible clouds. The hooks pulled once gently, and Kai felt a soft internal pop behind the left eye, the terrible, subtle sensation of a fruit loosening from its stem, and then pain flooded him so bright it became color, and he screamed soundlessly because the scream had no place left to live. The left eye slid free, not like gore, not like violence, but like an expensive pearl removed from a setting. The socket did not gush. It wept that clear, sticky, sweet fluid, and the eye itself, still glossy, still noble, still bright with someone else's confidence, rolled down Kai's cheek as if reluctant to touch a beggar's skin, then dropped onto the altar with a soft, wet tap. Kai's remaining eye watched it, wide with horror, and for a brief, unbearable second he saw through both perspectives at once, his own fear from the right, and the left eye's strange, calm detachment from the altar's surface, like the part itself had been freed and was already forgetting him. The mirrors along the wall brightened, their surfaces trembling as if excited, and the loose eye rolled across the altar toward them with tiny muscle movements Kai could not control, dragged by ownership, by contract, by hunger's law, until it pressed itself against a cracked bronze mirror and sank into it slowly, swallowed without ripple as though the mirror were not glass but a mouth. Kai convulsed, sobbing, clutching at his face with trembling fingers, and the itching under his skin turned into a deep, cold, hollowing sensation, as if the shrine was scooping out not only parts but the story that held those parts together, unthreading his identity from the inside. The stern older face in the mirror drew closer, now clearer than ever, and Kai could see the fine details that proved the truth. Clean pores, a healed scar, a gaze used to being obeyed, and behind that face, reflected faintly, was a room Kai had never been in. Silk curtains, lacquered furniture, lantern light warm as gold, the kind of chamber where a man sleeps without fear of rats. The rich man's lips moved, and Kai felt the words not as sound, but as a weight pressed against his collapsing mind. Thank you. The gratitude was worse than cruelty, because it made Kai feel like a service, like a useful tool, like a rag used to polish jewels. Then the hooks tightened on the remaining eye, and Kai fought wildly, slamming his forehead against the stone floor until stars burst in his vision, because if he destroyed the eye, perhaps it could not be returned. Perhaps he could spite the owner at least once, but the shrine's logic was older than spite. His forehead bruised, his blood diluted into sweet fluid at the wound, and the eye remained intact, held carefully by invisible hands that treated it like treasure. The seam mouth exhaled slowly, filling the shrine with the scent of ferment and incense, and Kai felt the right eye loosen, with the same soft internal pop, followed by a cold suction as it slid free. And this time, as the world went half dark, he saw something that broke his last thread of hope. Behind the candle flames, beneath the altar stone, the floor had a faint carved circle, an emblem of a mouth surrounded by dozens of small grooves that looked like tally marks, each groove representing another borrower, another beggar, another desperate soul who had come here to trade dignity for borrowed flesh. The right eye fell into Kai's palm for an instant, warm and slick, and in that instant, he felt a rush of memories that weren't his banquets. A child's laughter calling father, the clink of jade, the smell of clean rain over palace gardens. And those memories hit Sai like a drug so sweet it made him whimper, not because of pain but because of longing, because he finally understood the true punishment. The shrine didn't just take parts, it let you taste a life you could never truly have, and then ripped it away while the taste was still on your tongue. His fingers curled around the eye in frantic possessiveness, and the shrine responded immediately with a pulse of cold through his wrist, the return mark burning like iron, and his fingers unclenched against his will as if the contract itself had bitten the tendons, and the eye rolled away across the altar, leaving Kai clutching empty air. It slid into the mirror like the first, and when it vanished, Kai's world collapsed into darkness that wasn't peaceful but thick and wet, full of the sounds of stitching and pulling, full of the quiet administrative satisfaction of repossession. He sensed, not saw his remaining arm being measured next, his throat tightening, as if someone had wrapped silk around it, his skin cooling as though the noble oil scent was draining out of him drop by drop, leaving only the old alley stink beneath. The shrine did not kill him quickly. It returned him carefully, reducing him the way a lender reduces a debtor, not to nothing, but to a body capable of learning the lesson. When sensation returned, it arrived as cold stone against his cheek, and the distant drip of water like time itself leaking. And Kai opened his eyes. No, he tried to, and realized he could not see at all, not because his lids were closed, but because his sockets were empty and smooth, sealed with faint, sticky sweetness. He gasped, and his breath rasped through a throat that felt narrower, raw, as if even his voice had been chewed thin. He reached up to touch his face and felt scarless hollows, and the terror that rose in him was so pure it almost became clarity. He was alive, but he would never again see the gold he craved, never again watch carriages glide, never again measure himself against men in silk. He crawled blindly out of the shrine, guided by smell and sound, hands shaking, and the city greeted him with indifferent noise vendors, bells, distant laughter. But now those sounds were sharper, crueler, because they were all he had. He found his way back to the alley like an animal returning to its wound. And there, in his corner behind the crates, he wept until his chest hurt, until the tears dried into nothing, because his eyes were gone. Days passed, or hours. Time in darkness becomes a thick soup. And Kai learned quickly that the alley had not become kinder. Children threw pebbles at him. Men kicked his bowl. Women crossed themselves as if blindness might be contagious. And in the hollow darkness of his face, Kai felt the final shape of his punishment. Not death, but humiliation multiplied. Poverty made permanent and undeniable. Yet the worst horror did not come from the street. It came at night, when the city quieted and the drains began to whisper, because in those hours Kai could sometimes hear, faintly, the sound of mirrors shifting like glass breathing, and with it a soft, satisfied sigh from somewhere far away, as if a wealthy man had settled into bed with refreshed vision, refreshed hands, refreshed skin, while Kai lay in filth as the city's forgotten mouth. Once, on a night when rain softened the cobbles and the air smelled briefly clean, Kai heard footsteps pause near his alley, and someone leaned close enough that he caught the scent of sandalwood, pure, expensive, flawless, and a voice murmured with polite amusement, "Good evening," as if greeting an old acquaintance. Kai froze, trembling, because he recognized the cadence, the cold ownership behind the kindness, and in the darkness he could do nothing but listen as the footsteps continued on, unhurried, confident, the sound of a man walking with perfect sight. The next morning, a rumor spread through the market that a certain lord, one who had been ill for months, had suddenly recovered, his gaze bright again, his hands steady enough to sign contracts, his body thriving, as though youth had been poured back into him, and merchants praised it as blessing, as fortune, as fate, while in the alley Kai sat blind and shaking, and if you had watched closely, you might have noticed the faint bruised ring still circling his wrists like a shackle, and beneath it, written in invisible ink only hunger, reads a final ledger mark that the shrine had stamped into him: paid.